Vernon Kincaid didn't knock. He pushed open the gate to Red Willow Farm like he already owned it, his boots crunching across the dry yard, while Lenora Ashcombe was still on her knees in the dirt, wrapping a torn feed bag with her bandaged hands. He stopped a few feet away, looked down at her, and smiled, not the smile of a man offering help, but the smile of a man who had already decided how this would end. "Still fighting it, are you?" he said. "That's almost admirable, Lenora. Almost." He dropped a folded paper onto the ground in front of her. A new offer. Lower than the last one. "Your hands are bleeding through the wrap again," he added, turning to leave. "Take the money before you lose the fingers, too." If you've never seen a woman refuse to break even when everything around her already has, stay with this story. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that remind us what real strength looks like. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The summer of 1887 arrived in Harrow County, Texas, the way bad news always does, quietly at first, then all at once. By the middle of June, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Red Willow Farm had dropped to a thin brown trickle. The grass in the south pasture went from yellow to gray. 3 of Lenora Ashcombe's best-laying hens died in the heat on the same afternoon, and she buried them herself behind the coop without telling anyone, because there was no one to tell. She was 30 years old, and she had been running this farm alone for 14 months. Her father, Harold Ashcombe, had died the previous spring, not dramatically, not from a horse accident or a gunfight, but from pneumonia that started as a stubborn cough in February and finished him by April. He died in his own bed with Lenora holding his right hand and the unpaid feed bill sitting on the kitchen table where she could see it through the open door. Harold had been a careful man, not a wealthy one. He left Lenora the farm, the livestock, the equipment, a modest amount of debt, and one piece of advice she kept turning over in her head every time she wanted to quit. Red Willow's got more in it than it shows. Don't let anybody tell you different. She hadn't known exactly what he meant at the time. She'd assumed it was the kind of thing a dying man says to the child he's leaving behind, comfort wrapped in vagueness. But she'd held on to it anyway, the same way she held on to everything that had belonged to him. Lenora was not a small woman. She had known that her entire life in the particular way that women in small frontier towns always know such things, through the looks, the comments, the particular silence that falls when a large woman walks into a room full of people who have already decided what her body means about her character. Harrow County had opinions about Lenora Ashcombe that it had been forming since she was 12 years old, and it had not updated them much since. She was too big to manage a farm alone, too heavy for the work, too stubborn to know when she was beaten, too proud to accept charity. That last one, at least, they got right. She woke before sunrise every morning. She fed the animals, checked the fences, pulled water from the well, tracked the levels in the irrigation channels her father had dug, bargained hard at the feed store in town, and came home with calluses that kept building over themselves until her hands were rough as old leather. She was not graceful about any of it. She sweated. She swore when she dropped things. She sat down on a fence post sometimes in the middle of the afternoon and put her face in her hands for 5 minutes before she got back up. But she always got back up. The trouble started in earnest on a Thursday in late July. She was repairing the bottom wire on the north fence line, the section that ran closest to the road, where the soil was hardest, and the wire stakes worked loose every few weeks no matter how deep she drove them. She had her wire cutters in her right hand and a new length of barbed wire in her left, and she was working quickly because the sky looked like rain, and she wanted the fence closed before the cattle got restless. The wire slipped. It happened fast. One moment she had it controlled, the next it snapped back and caught her across both palms, left hand worse than right, a deep ragged cut that went from the base of her thumb almost to her wrist. She made a sound she was glad no one heard. She stood there for a moment, with blood running down both wrists, dripping into the dry dirt, and she breathed through her nose and looked at the unfinished fence, and made a decision that probably wasn't smart. She tore strips from the hem of her work shirt and wrapped both hands tight enough to slow the bleeding. Then she finished the fence. By the time she walked back to the house, the wrappings were soaked through on the left side, and the right hand had stiffened badly. She cleaned the cuts as well as she could, used the last of the clean cloth she kept for such things, and went to bed wondering if she'd need to ride into town for proper medical attention. She didn't ride into town. She couldn't afford to lose a day's work, and she couldn't afford to let anyone in Harrow County see her injured if she could help it. Weakness was information, and information in this county had a way of reaching Vernon Kincaid faster than it had any right to. Vernon Kincaid was the kind of man who made Harrow County function, or so he liked to believe. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had partial interest in the bank, supplied feed to half the ranchers in the region, and sat on every committee worth sitting on. He was 53, lean, well-dressed for a cattleman, and had a way of speaking to people that sounded polite until you thought about it later and realized he'd been threatening you the entire time. He had been after Red Willow Farm for 2 years. His first offer came 6 weeks after Harold Ashcombe's funeral so quickly that Lenora had understood immediately it wasn't condolence, it was calculation. He'd offered a price that was insultingly below what the land was worth, even in its current struggling condition. And he'd delivered it with a tone of gentle concern that made Lenora's teeth ache. "I'd hate to see you overwhelmed," he'd said. "Farming alone is hard enough for a man. For a woman in your situation, it must be exhausting." She'd told him the farm wasn't for sale. He'd nodded like she'd said something endearing and left. The offers came back every few months, always a little lower than the one before, as if he was timing them to coincide with each new difficulty. The drought pushed a second offer. The broken irrigation pump prompted a third. When 2 of her best milk cows sickened in the spring, a fourth offer appeared within a week, hand-delivered by Kincaid himself, which meant someone had told him about the cows almost immediately. Lenora had started keeping her difficulties quiet after that. It didn't help much. Harrow County was not a large place, and people talked, and Kincaid seemed to have ears in every corner of it. The morning after her hands were cut, she was in the barn trying to assess the damage to the north fence properly. Her right hand swollen enough to make gripping difficult when she heard boots on the gravel outside. She turned, expecting trouble, and found a stranger. He was maybe 35, lean in the way of men who don't eat regularly, with a battered hat pulled low and a bedroll tied to a saddle that had seen better years. His horse was a gray mare that looked tired, but not mistreated, that told Lenora something about him before he opened his mouth. "Morning," he said. He had a quiet voice, no particular performance in it. "Name's Calder Fenwick. Saw your gate from the road. I'm looking for workday labor, odd jobs, whatever you have. I won't eat much." Lenora looked at him. "Where are you from?" "Kansas, originally. More recently, nowhere specific." "That's not a very reassuring answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She studied him another moment. Her hands were throbbing, and the pump on the north well had been making a grinding sound for 3 days, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours the night before. "You know anything about water pumps?" she said. "Some." That's also not reassuring. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "I know enough to know when they're about to fail completely. That grinding sound yours is making, I could hear it from the gate." She looked at her wrapped hands. She looked at the barn door. She thought about what it would cost her to lose the north pump entirely. "I'll give you your meals and 50 cents a day," she said. "You sleeps in the barn. You steal anything, I'll have the sheriff out before you're past the county line." "Fair enough," he said. That was how Calder Fenwick came to Red Willow Farm. He fixed the pump that same afternoon, not just patched it, actually fixed it, sourcing a replacement part from a section of broken equipment she'd been storing behind the barn for a year and a half because she couldn't bear to throw away anything that might prove useful. He worked without talking much, which she appreciated, and without watching her to see how she managed with her hands, which she appreciated more. She brought him supper on the porch, leftover beans and cornbread, nothing impressive, and he ate it without comment, which in Lenora's experience was the sign of a man who was actually hungry rather than performing gratitude. "You planning to stay in Harrow County?" she asked. "Hadn't planned that far." He set the empty bowl down. "Are you planning to ask where I've been for the last 3 years? That's your business." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people ask." "Most people are more curious about strangers than is helpful to them," Lenora said. "I figure if there's something I need to know, I'll find out, eventually. In the meantime, you fix the pump." He was quiet for a bit. "Then your hands." "Both of them? Wire accident. Barbed wire cut across the palm like that. You should have had those stitched. I couldn't afford to lose the day." He didn't say anything else about it. Didn't tell her she was foolish or stubborn or that she should ask for help more readily. He just picked up the bowl and the fork and carried them back inside without being asked, and she could hear him washing them in the basin before he went out to the barn. She sat on the porch for a while after that, listening to the night sounds and the distant low of cattle, and thought that was probably the most comfortable she had felt in company in longer than she could easily remember. Kincaid came to the farm 3 days after Calder arrived. He came in the middle of the morning, which was when he always came deliberately, Lenora had always believed, because the middle of the morning was when a working farmer was most pressed, most tired from the early start, and most aware of the day's work still ahead. He rode up to the gate on his good black horse, dismounted without hurry, and walked across the yard like a man inspecting something he was in the process of acquiring. Lenora was near the water trough when she saw him. She didn't stop what she was doing. Lenora. He stopped at a conversational distance and looked around the yard with the practiced air of someone calculating value. His gaze moved to Calder, who was repairing a section of the henhouse roof and had not turned around. "You've got help, I see. Day labor," she said. His tone made the single sound carry considerable skepticism. "Must be costing you. Everything costs something." He smiled that particular smile, the one that didn't reach anywhere useful. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. "I had my attorney update the offer. Given that the drought hasn't broken and you've had some trouble lately. I told you the farm isn't for sale, Vernon. You did. But circumstances change." He held the paper out. "This is fair, Lenora. Given everything." She didn't take it. "Given everything meaning what, exactly?" "Your father's debts. The drought. Those hands." He nodded toward her wrapped palms. "You're a capable woman. I mean that sincerely. But there are limits to what one person can sustain, and the people who love this county don't enjoy watching someone struggle needlessly." "Then they don't have to watch," she said. "The farm isn't for sale." His expression didn't change, not visibly, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold for just a moment before the courteous mask came back. He set the folded paper on top of the fence post beside her. "I'll leave it," he said, "in case you want to look it over in a quieter moment." He turned back toward his horse. Then, as if it had just occurred to him, he glanced toward where Calder was working. "That man, you know anything about him?" "I know he fixed my pump." "Is that all?" It wasn't quite a question. Drifters have a way of creating complications for people who take them in. "I'd be careful, Lenora. You're already carrying a lot." He rode out. Lenora stood and watched him go, and then she picked up his folded paper offer off the fence post and walked it to the burn barrel by the corner of the barn. Calder came down from the henhouse roof. He'd been listening, she could tell. "He does that often," he said, "every few months. Offer gets lower each time. You know why he wants the property specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. "My father thought so. Said there was more to this land than it shows." She shook her head. He never explained it fully. Maybe he didn't know fully, but he believed it. Calder was looking at the dry ground, at the slight way the land sloped toward the south. His expression was thoughtful in a way that she'd already learned to pay attention to. He didn't make that face casually. "What?" she said, nothing certain. He looked up. "How deep is your well?" "The north one? Maybe 40 feet. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. "Is there a map of the property? Your father's notes, anything about the land?" Inside his desk, she studied him. "Calder, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking your father might have been right," he said. "That's all." She didn't push it. But she didn't sleep well that night either, turning over everything her father had ever said about the farm, about what lay beneath it, about why she should never let it go. The following week, a rider came to Harrow County that nobody expected. Lenora saw him first, a man in a gray coat with a federal badge pinned to the lapel, riding down the main road toward town with the particular unhurried purpose of someone who already knows where they're going. She was at the feed store loading sacks into the wagon when she saw him, and she might not have given him much thought except that he paused at the corner and asked Denton, the feed store owner, a question she couldn't hear, and Denton glanced toward her wagon. She went home without saying anything. That evening, she told Calder about the rider. He went very still. "Federal badge," she said, "gray coat," asking questions. He set down the harness he'd been mending and was quiet for long enough that she started to feel uneasy. "Calder, there's something I should have told you earlier," he said. "I should have said it before I stayed past the first day, probably." He looked at her directly, which he always did when he was saying something important. She'd noticed that about him. 3 years ago, I was working for a man in Kansas who did survey work. Legitimate work, at first. He contracted with landowners, assessed their properties. But I started noticing things that didn't add up. Properties he'd surveyed kept getting bought out by the same set of buyers at prices well below what they were worth. And there was a man behind it, a speculator named Silas Vane. He'd identify valuable properties, water rights, mineral potential, things the owners didn't know about, and then arrange to have them acquired cheap. Lenora listened without speaking. I collected documents, Calder continued. Survey records, correspondence, transaction records. Enough to take to the territorial land office. But before I could get there, there was a fire. He paused. At the office where the records were stored. They said I started it. Did you? I was trying to pull records out of it, he said. The fire was already going when I got there. But I was the one who was there. And I was the one who'd been making trouble for people who had money and connections. So you ran. So I ran, he agreed. There's a warrant. It's old, but it's still active. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the night insects were going. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle and left the rest of the kitchen in shadow. Silas Vane, she said finally. You think he's connected to Kincaid? I think the pattern is the same. I think someone identified something valuable under your land, maybe under several properties in this county, and I think Kincaid is the local piece of a larger operation. He leaned forward slightly. Your father said there was more to the land than it shows. What if he was right? What if there's water, a real aquifer, not just well depth and someone's known about it for years? The word landed in the kitchen like a stone in still water. Water. In drought country. An underground aquifer beneath 11 struggling farms would be worth more than all the cattle and buildings on all of them combined. It would be worth nearly anything. If Kincaid has surveys, Lenora said slowly, documents that prove he knew about water under these properties before he started buying them, then every purchase he's made in the last few years is fraud, Calder said. Every offer he's made to you is fraud. Every family he's pushed out. How do we prove it? He shook his head. I don't know yet, but I know what to look for. Survey documents, geological assessments, correspondence between Kincaid and anyone who might be Vane's associate. Those things exist. Men like this keep records because they need them to coordinate. She was quiet again. Her hands were resting on the table, the wrappings slightly looser now as the cuts began to heal slowly, imperfectly, with occasional inflammation that reminded her every morning that the healing wasn't finished. The federal marshal, she said. If he's here about your warrant, then someone told him I was here, Calder said, which means someone is watching this farm closely enough to notice I arrived. That thought settled over the kitchen like a change in weather. Sleep in the barn tonight, Lenora said, not because I don't trust you, but because if that marshal comes here in the morning, I want to be able to say with a straight face that I hired a laborer I barely know. That's true, though. I know, she said. That's why I can say it with a straight face. He almost smiled. He gathered up the harness and went out to the barn, and Lenora sat alone at the kitchen table for another hour, looking at her scarred hands and thinking about everything that lay beneath the ground she was fighting so hard to keep. The marshal came the next morning. He was a careful man, polite, methodical, not the kind who blustered. He introduced himself as Marshal Everett Kane, showed her his identification, and asked if she had taken on a ranch hand, recently named Calder Fenwick. I hired a man a week or so ago, she said. He gave me a name. Whether it's his real one, I couldn't say. Where is he now? Working, I'd expect. I don't keep track of every hour. She met Kane's eyes without shifting. What's this about, Marshal? There's a warrant for a Calder Fenwick out of Kansas. Arson. He watched her face carefully. You know anything about that? I know my pump is fixed and my henhouse roof stopped leaking, she said. That's what I know about the man I hired. Kane looked around the yard for a moment, taking in the layout, the condition of the fences, the small details that told a lawman what kind of operation he was looking at. Whatever he saw seemed to soften something in his approach. You're Harold Ashcombe's daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. I knew your father, briefly. He was a straight man, he paused. I'm going to need to speak with your laborer, Miss Ashcombe. Then you're welcome to look for him, she said. And when you find him, you're welcome to speak with him. I won't interfere with your business, Marshal. I just ask that if he's been useful to me, and you don't immediately find cause to haul him off, you let me know before you take him. Kane studied her for a moment with something that might have been respect, and might have been calculation, and might have been both. Fair enough, he said. He found Calder at the north fence line, working alone, and Lenora watched from a distance as the two men talked. It was a long conversation, longer than she expected. She couldn't hear any of it. At one point, Calder turned and looked toward the house, found her watching, and looked back at the marshal. The marshal left without taking Calder. He came back to the house afterward and told her the warrant was still active, but that Kane had questions about the original investigation, questions that suggested the Kansas case was more complicated than a simple arson charge. He didn't say what he'd told Kane exactly. She didn't ask. But that evening, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, Calder said something she hadn't expected. "You didn't tell him I'd told you about the warrant." "No. You could have. Would have made your position cleaner. Maybe." She looked at the horizon where the sun was going orange and flat above the dry hills. "But I don't think you started that fire." He was quiet. "I don't have any proof of that," she added. "Just my read of you, which isn't evidence." "No," he said, "it isn't. But it's what I think." She shifted on the porch step. "My father used to say that you could tell more about a man from what he doesn't do than what he does. You had plenty of chances to lie to me and you didn't. That matters to me." The evening went quiet around them, not the heavy silence of tension, but something looser than that, something that had more room in it. "I'm going to find those survey documents," Calder said eventually. "Whatever Kincaid is hiding about this land. If the evidence is there, we can take it to someone who can use it." "We," she said. He looked at her. "If you want, I know it's your farm." "It is my farm," she agreed, "which means it's my fight. But I've been told I don't have to fight alone." It was the first time she'd acknowledged what he'd said to her. That very first morning, she watched something shift in his expression when she said it, something quiet and not quite prepared. "No," he said, "you don't." The lamp in the kitchen window threw its small yellow light out into the yard. Somewhere in the dark pasture, one of the cattle shifted and was still. The pump at the north well was working steadily now, the sound of it carrying in the night air consistent, functional, repaired. Lenora Ashcombe looked at her wrapped hands, then at the farm around her, then at the man sitting 3 feet away who had arrived with nothing and stayed with purpose. She had been fighting alone for 14 months. She was tired in the way that doesn't come from one bad day, but from 314 bad days, stacked on top of each other with no one to hand anything to at the end of them. But beneath this ground, if her father was right, if Calder was right, there was something worth protecting. Something Kincaid had known about for years, while he smiled and offered her insultingly low prices and waited for her hands to give out. She wasn't going to let him have it. Not the farm, not the water, not the proof, and not the ending her father had spent his life believing she deserved. She stood up from the porch step, her hands aching and her back stiff, and her jaw set with the specific, quiet stubbornness that people who had known her since childhood recognized as the look Harold Ashcombe's daughter got when something had been decided. "We start looking for those documents tomorrow," she said. Calder nodded once. Tomorrow, she went inside. The lamp burned low in the kitchen. And outside in the dark, Red Willow Farm breathed and waited, not like something dying, but like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting for someone to finally believe in what was buried beneath it. They started with her father's desk. Harold Ashcombe had been a methodical man in some ways, and completely chaotic in others, which meant his desk was simultaneously organized and impossible. There were labeled folders for livestock records, feed costs, land tax payments going back 15 years. And then there were the other things, loose papers shoved behind the folders, folded notes tucked into the backs of drawers, small observations written in his cramped hand on whatever paper had been nearby when the thought arrived. Receipts, mostly. The backs of envelopes. One long note written on the inside cover of a seed catalog from 1881. Lenora spread everything on the kitchen table while Calder sat across from her, and they went through it piece by piece in the early morning before the heat built up enough to make thinking difficult. She found the first thing that mattered on the second morning of searching. It was a letter not addressed to Harold, but to a surveyor named Prentice Odom, and it had been folded inside a tax document from 1883, as if Harold had tucked it there deliberately, and then either forgotten or decided not to act on it. The letter was brief, written in a careful formal hand, and it discussed the results of a geological assessment of properties in the southern tier of Harrow County. The language was technical enough that Lenora had to read it twice to understand it, and even then she understood only the shape of it. She slid it across the table to Calder. He read it once, quickly. Then he read it again, slowly. "Where did your father get this?" he said. "I don't know. He never mentioned it. This is from a survey firm." He set it flat on the table and pressed his fingers against the edge of it as if he needed to keep it from moving. "It's talking about subsurface water indicators. Geological formations consistent with a significant aquifer. And it lists properties." He looked up at her. "Red Willow is on this list, Lenora." She had expected it, maybe. Had been half braced for it, since the night Calder first said the word aquifer out loud in her kitchen. But hearing it confirmed in her father's letter, in a document her father had kept hidden in his desk for years. "He knew," she said. "He knew and he didn't tell me. Maybe he was protecting you." Calder's voice was careful. "Or maybe he didn't know what to do with it yet. He told me the land had more in it than it showed." She looked at the letter. "He just never told me what kind of more." She picked the letter up and held it, and her hands were not quite steady, both the healing one and the less damaged one, both trembling slightly with something that was not fear and not grief exactly, but some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name. "Calder, how valuable is an aquifer?" He was quiet for a moment. "In drought country? With 11 properties above it, some of them struggling, some already sold to Kincaid?" He chose his words. "It would be the most valuable thing in this county. By a long distance." She set the letter down. "He's known for years, most likely. And he's been offering all of us prices that don't account for any of it." "That's the fraud," Calder said. "That's exactly the fraud. He knows what's there. He's acquired the knowledge through surveys he commissioned, or surveys someone commissioned for him, and then he goes to landowners, who don't know what's underneath them, and offers them distressed prices based on surface conditions. It's the same pattern as Vane." She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the yard, the patched fences, the repaired henhouse roof, the north pump working steadily. "The letter alone isn't enough," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No. It shows your father had information. It doesn't show Kincaid commissioned any surveys. We'd need documents that connect him directly to the geological assessments. Correspondence. Survey records with his name on them, or payments from him to the surveyors. So where would those be?" Calder leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The county land office keeps records of any officially filed survey. But Kincaid wouldn't file anything he didn't want public," he thought. "A private surveyor would keep his own records. And Kincaid would keep copies. Men like him always keep copies. Documentation is how they control the operation. So we need to get to his records, or to someone who's seen them." She turned from the window. "The clerk at the land office. Merritt Dunbar. He's worked there for 20 years. He knows everything that's been filed. Would he talk? He's a careful man, nervous. He doesn't like trouble." She paused. "But he liked my father, and I think he's afraid of Kincaid in the particular way that people are afraid of something they know too much about." Calder nodded slowly. "Worth trying. I'll go alone," she said. "You going to town with me draws attention. People talk about you being here already." "I know." He looked at her. "Are you all right going alone?" "I've been going alone for 14 months, she said, not sharply, just as a fact. He nodded. "Right." She went to town the next morning, early, before the midday crowd filled the main street. She tied her wagon outside the post office and walked to the county land office with her hands wrapped in the clean cotton she'd taken to using. The cuts were healing, but the left hand still needed protection. And besides, the wrapping had become a kind of armor. People saw it and felt awkward, and awkward people left her alone faster. Merritt Dunbar was behind his counter when she came in, sorting through a stack of filed claims with the air of a man who has been doing the same task for so long that his hands do it without consulting his brain. He was small, gray-haired, with spectacles that had been repaired at the left hinge with a piece of wire. He looked up when she came in, and something shifted in his expression, not alarm, exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as if her presence required him to be more deliberate than usual. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "what can I do for you?" She looked around the office. They were alone. "I want to ask you something, Merritt, and I want to ask it plain, because I don't have time to come at it sideways." She moved to the counter. "Have you ever seen a geological survey filed for the southern tier properties? Water assessments? Anything about subsurface formations?" He put down the papers he was holding, very carefully. "The way you set something down when you need both hands free, in case you need them." "Why are you asking that?" he said. Because I think Vernon Kincaid has been buying land in this county knowing about an underground water source that he never disclosed to the sellers, including my father. Merritt Dunbar took off his spectacles and cleaned them with the front of his shirt, a gesture so automatic she knew it was what he did when he was stalling. That's a serious accusation, he said. It is. He put his spectacles back on and looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating something, not whether she was right, she thought, but how much it would cost him to say so. Your father came to see me, he said quietly, about 3 years ago. He had found something I don't know where. He didn't tell me, and he wanted to know if any surveys had been officially filed for his land or the neighboring properties. He paused. I told him nothing had been officially filed. But, he looked at the door, then back at her. But I had seen something come through the office informally, not a proper filing. A reference, a notation, and a set of correspondence between Kincaid and a surveying firm out of San Antonio. It was attached to a separate document that was legitimately filed, and I only saw it because I was processing the packet. He lowered his voice. It referenced an assessment of subsurface water potential in the southern tier. Multiple properties. Red Willow was named, and you didn't. She stopped herself. She took a breath. Merritt, what did you do with it? I noted it in my personal record, he said. I didn't report it because I didn't know to whom, and because the man it implicated owns a quarter of this county, and I have 3 daughters and a mother-in-law. He met her eyes. I am not a brave man, Miss Ashcombe, I know that. Do you still have your personal record? Another long pause. The office was quiet except for the sound of someone walking past outside on the boardwalk. Yes, he said. Will you let me see it? He stopped. Started again. If I do and this goes somewhere, Kincaid will know it came from me. I have no question about that. If we can get enough evidence, Kincaid won't be in a position to do much to anyone, she said. But I won't lie to you. There's risk. I can't promise you nothing goes wrong. He looked at her hands, the wrapped palms, the careful way she held them. Something moved across his face that wasn't pity. It was more like recognition. Your father was a good man, he said. He didn't deserve what happened to him. No, she said, he didn't. Merritt Dunbar went into the back room. She heard him moving things, opening something that sounded like a locked drawer. He came back with a small bound notebook, the kind a meticulous man uses for private record-keeping, not official business. He opened it to a marked page and turned it to face her. She read it again. The notation was dated 1,884 3 years before her father died. It referenced the San Antonio surveying firm, a communication with Kincaid, and specific geological terminology she now recognized from the letter in her father's desk. There were property descriptions. 8 of them. Red Willow was the 3rd. Can I copy this? She said. You can take the notebook, he said. I've kept it for 3 years, not knowing what to do with it. If you can do something with it, then it was worth keeping. She took it. She pressed it against her chest with her wrapped hands. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Just don't let it come to nothing. She drove back to Red Willow faster than she should have, pushing the horse harder than was fair on a warm morning, and when she came through the gate, Calder was at the fence line and straightened up when he saw how she was moving and was walking toward her before she'd fully stopped the wagon. She climbed down and showed him the notebook. He read it standing in the yard with the sun on his back, and she watched his expression as he went through it focused. Careful, then something that might have been satisfaction but was more complicated than that. This is real, he said. Merritt Dunbar kept it for 3 years. He's been sitting on this. He's frightened. He has daughters. She took the notebook back. Is it enough? To connect Kincaid to prior knowledge of the aquifer? This and your father's letter together, yes. It shows he commissioned assessments of properties he was simultaneously offering to buy. It shows he had knowledge the sellers didn't. He looked at her. But we need someone who can take it officially. An attorney. Someone with standing to bring this to the Territorial Land Office or a federal court. Beatrice Hollowell, Lenora said. Calder frowned slightly. A woman attorney? She passed the bar in '82. She operates out of Millhaven, 18 miles east. She's handled 3 land disputes in this county in the last 2 years, and she won 2 of them. Lenora looked at him steadily. You have a problem with that? No, he said. And he meant it. She could tell. I just didn't know she was there. Most people don't. That's probably why she wins. He almost smiled. We should ride to her. Not yet. We need more before we go to anyone. The notebook and the letter give us a picture, But Kincaid's attorney will argue it's circumstantial. We need the survey documents themselves, or testimony from someone inside his operation, she thought. Someone who's seen the actual assessments. That could be anyone he employed, Calder said. Surveyor, clerk, foreman, or it could be Garrett Osley. He looked at her. Who's that? Kincaid's land manager. He was with Kincaid for 7 years. He left about 8 months ago. Nobody knows exactly why, but there was an argument. He's been running a small horse operation outside of Denton Creek. She paused. He used to know my father. They got along. A disgruntled former employee, Calder said slowly, who left under bad circumstances, who might be willing to talk if he thought it would protect him and cause Kincaid real trouble, or who might go straight to Kincaid the moment we approach him. Yes, she said. That's the risk. They stood in the yard with the morning getting hotter around them, and the notebook was in her hands. And somewhere beneath their feet, hundreds of feet below the dry ground, water moved through stone in the slow, patient way that water does when it has been there for centuries and intends to remain. I want to go to Osley, she said. When? Day after tomorrow. I need to think about how to approach him first. Calder nodded. He looked at the notebook. Keep that somewhere Kincaid can't find it. She looked at him. Any suggestions from a man who's had important documents disappear on him before? That landed, she saw it, but he took it without flinching. Not in the obvious place. Not in your father's desk. She thought for a moment. Then she walked to the barn, and he followed her, and she went to the back corner where her father's wooden post, the one she'd kept, because she couldn't bring herself to sell it. She worked the stitching on the side panel until a small section came loose, revealing a shallow space that had been sewn into the leather. She looked at Calder. Your father, he said. He was a careful man, she said, in some ways. She folded the notebook small and worked it into the saddle along with her copied letter, and then pressed the leather back into place. It didn't look disturbed if you didn't know what to look for. They went back outside, and Calder went back to the fence work, and Lenora went to the garden, and the afternoon passed the way afternoons did at Red Willow, with labor, with silence, with the particular quality of endurance that was not the same as peace, but was what you had when peace wasn't available. That evening, a rider came to the farm that Lenora didn't recognize. Young man, maybe 20, uncomfortable in the saddle in the way of someone who doesn't ride regularly. He had a folded note that he said was from a man in town who wanted to remain unnamed. He handed it to Lenora, didn't wait for a reply, and rode back toward the road. She opened it. The note was short, 8 words written in a hand she didn't recognize. They know about your hired man. Be careful. She brought it inside and showed Calder. He read it and set it on the table. Who sent it, he said. I don't know. Could be Merritt. Could be someone else entirely. Or it could be Kincaid testing how you respond. She looked at the note. You think he'd do that? I think he's a man who uses information as a tool. If he's not sure what you know or what you're doing, he might send something like this to see whether you panic. He paused. Did Merritt know you came in asking about surveys? Of course. He was right there. And if Kincaid has someone watching that office, then he knows I came in asking questions. She sat down. Merritt. Is he safe? I don't know. She pushed back from the table. I should go back to town. In the dark? In the morning, early. She looked at the note. If someone's watching, and they think Merritt gave me something, he's in a worse position than before I came in. Calder looked at her across the table. Lenora, if Kincaid knows you're looking, he's going to move. Whatever he's planning, accelerating the loan pressure, finding another way to force the sale, he'll do it faster. I know. Which means we may not have as much time as I thought. I know that too. He was quiet. Then, are you scared? She thought about it honestly. I've been scared for 14 months, she said. I'm used to it. That was true. Fear had become so continuous that it had stopped feeling like fear and had become more like weather present, sometimes severe, not a reason to stop moving. The next morning, she drove to town before 7 and went directly to Merritt Dunbar's house, not the office, the house, because she didn't want anyone watching the land office to see her going in a second time. His wife answered the door and called for him, and he appeared in the hallway, looking like a man who hadn't slept. Someone came to see me yesterday afternoon, he'd said before she could speak, after you left. One of Kincaid's men, not Kincaid himself, someone who runs errands for him. He asked if I'd had any unusual inquiries about survey filings. She felt cold, despite the heat. What did you tell him? I said it had been quiet. I don't think he believed me. Merritt pressed his lips together. He stood in my office for a long time looking around. Then he left. Merritt, the notebook is safe. You need to tell me honestly, are you going to be all right? He looked at her for a long moment, then past her at the street, then back. I've been not all right for 3 years, he said quietly. I think I'm tired of it. She understood that. She understood it specifically. Back at the farm by mid-morning, she found Calder in the south pasture, mending a section of fence that had gone down in the night not dramatically, just slowly failed the way old things do. A post rotted at the base, giving up at last. She told him about Merritt. Kincaid's moving, Calder said. He drove a new post into the ground with 3 hard strikes. He's checking his perimeter. We need to see Osley before Kincaid figures out what we have. Tomorrow. Today, she said. This afternoon. He looked at her. Your hands are not the issue right now. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Let me finish this section. An hour. They rode to Denton Creek that afternoon, taking the back road that ran along the ridge rather than the main county track. Lenora's left hand ached from holding the reins, but she managed it by adjusting her grip and not mentioning it. And Calder rode beside her without commenting on the pace or the heat or the fact that she shifted her hand every 20 minutes. Garrett Osley's place was modest, a small house, a decent barn, a paddock with 4 horses in good condition. A man sitting on the porch who stood up slowly when he saw them coming, not with alarm, but with the wariness of someone who had learned to be careful about visitors. He was 50-something, heavy-set in the shoulders. With a gray beard he kept trimmed, and eyes that moved to Calder, and then to Lenora, and then back to Calder in a quick, involuntary sequence that told her he was trying to figure out who was the threat and who was the unknown. Miss Ashcombe, he said. He remembered her then. Harold's girl. That's right. She dismounted, careful with her hands. This is Calder Fenwick. He works at Red Willow. Osley's eyes moved to Calder again, and stayed there a beat longer than normal. Fenwick. He seemed to be deciding something. What brings you out here? I want to ask you about Vernon Kincaid, Lenora said, and what he knew about the water under our land. Osley went very still. Not the stillness of someone who doesn't know what you're talking about. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for a long time and isn't entirely sure whether to be relieved or terrified. You better come inside, he said. The inside of the house was neat in the spare way of a man living alone, everything in its place. Nothing extra. He brought 3 cups of water without asking and sat across from them at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface. How much do you know, he said. Enough, Lenora said. I have documents connecting Kincaid to geological surveys of the southern tier properties. I have a land office record confirming he had information about subsurface water before he began acquiring those properties. Osley looked at his hands, at the table, at something that wasn't in the room. I was with him for 7 years, he said. 7 years I managed his land acquisitions. I thought I told myself I didn't know exactly what I was part of, that I was just doing the land work, just the management. He stopped. I knew what he was doing, I just didn't know how to unknow it. What do you know? Calder said. His voice was steady, not aggressive. Just asking. I know there's a San Antonio firm Aldridge survey that he's paid for private assessments of at least 14 properties in this county. I know those assessments identified an aquifer system that runs beneath most of the southern tier. I know he's been acquiring those properties systematically for 6 years. Osley looked up. I know because I managed the payment ledgers. I recorded the transfers to Aldridge. I wrote the purchase offers. I drafted some of the letters. Silence landed in the kitchen. I left because he wanted me to accelerate the pressure on 3 families that were still holding out, Osley said. He wanted me to go to the bank, go to Hendricks, who manages the loans, and request that certain accounts be flagged for early collection. One of those accounts was yours, Miss Ashcombe. Lenora absorbed that without speaking. I told him I wouldn't, Osley said. We had words. He made it clear that if I walked, I'd better walk far enough that I wasn't a problem. He exhaled. I walked 18 miles and stayed. Do you still have copies of the payment ledgers? Calder said. I kept my personal copies, 7 years of records. I told myself it was for my own protection. He looked at Lenora. I should have done something with them before now. You can do something with them now, she said. He looked at her for a long time, this large, steady woman sitting across his kitchen table, with her bandaged hands resting flat and her eyes clear, and not asking him to be someone he wasn't. Just asking him to do one thing he probably should have done a year ago. Kincaid will come at me, he said. Yes, she said. Probably. He's got reach in this county, he does. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine. I'm not going to lie to you, she said. But I'll tell you this. If we take what you have and what I have to an attorney who knows land law, and if we bring it to the territorial authorities, Kincaid's reach gets a lot shorter a lot faster. He's only as powerful as the secret stays secret. Ozeli drummed his fingers once on the table. Stopped. There's something else, he said. Something you should know about your hired man. Calder went still across the table. I knew Silas Vane, Ozeli said quietly. Kincaid dealt with Vane's people 2 years ago. There was a referral, a consultant they brought in from Kansas to advise on how to structure some of the acquisitions so they'd survive legal scrutiny. The name Fenwick came up. They said he'd caused problems for Vane's operation. They said if anyone turned up using that name in connection with Harrow County, Kincaid wanted to know immediately. The kitchen was very quiet. Lenora looked at Calder. He was looking at Ozeli with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not anger, but something close to it, and beneath that, something older and more tired. He knows you're here, Ozeli said to Calder. Maybe not for certain. But if Kincaid's man has been asking questions around town. He knows, Calder said. Ozeli nodded. Then you don't have much time. Lenora stood up. Garrett, will you bring your ledgers and testify to what you know? He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up too. I'll bring the ledgers, he said. I'll testify to what I know. He looked out the window at his paddock, the 4 horses moving easy in the afternoon light. I've been a coward about this long enough. They rode back to Red Willow in the lowering afternoon, the sky going rose and copper in the west, and neither of them spoke much for the first several miles. Lenora's hands hurt. Her back hurt. She was calculating rapidly in her head what they had, what they needed, how quickly Kincaid might move if he was already watching. He knows you're here, she said finally. Not accusatory, just saying it. Probably has for a while, Calder said. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Being sorry doesn't fix anything. She looked at the road ahead. What does it change? It means he'll try to use the warrant as a lever. If he can get the marshal to remove me, you lose a witness, and you lose whatever I know about Vane's connection to his operation. Then we move before he does that. Lenora, tomorrow morning, she said. We ride to Beatrice Hollowell's office, all 3 of us, if Ozeli will come. We put everything in front of her, and we let her tell us what to do next. He was quiet for a pace or two. That's 18 miles each way. I know how far it is. Your hands, Calder. She said his name like a period at the end of a sentence. I've ridden further in worse condition. Are you coming? He looked at her sideways, this woman with her jaw set, and her wrapped hands holding the reins with the particular stubborn competence she brought to everything, who had been carrying a secret buried in her own ground for years without knowing it, who had lost her father and nearly lost her farm, and still went back to the fence line every morning. I'm coming, he said. The stars were out by the time they got back to Red Willow. Lenora put the horse up and went inside and ate cold biscuits, standing at the counter, because she was too tired to do anything else. And then she sat at the kitchen table, with the lamp turned low, and thought about her father. He had known. He had tucked that letter in his desk and kept it and said nothing, and she had always assumed his silence was about protecting her from worry. But maybe it was also about protecting something else, the possibility. The thing beneath the ground that he believed in and couldn't prove and didn't want taken from her before she had the chance to fight for it. Red Willow's got more in it than it shows. Don't let anybody tell you different. He'd known, and he'd trusted her to figure out the rest. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the scars already forming on her palms, the permanent marks that would be there for the rest of her life, mapped out in lines that crossed and overlapped like something deliberate. She wasn't going to let him down. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks she slept before midnight. And her dreams were not about fear or loss, but about water, the specific sound of it moving through dark stone, patient and unstoppable and real. She was up before the roosters. Not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, not really. The kind of sleeps that keeps stopping and starting like a wagon wheel, catching on rocks. But because lying in the dark, thinking about everything that could go wrong, was worse than getting up and doing something about it. She built the fire in the stove, put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky turn from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before first light, the color that makes the land look like it's holding its breath. Calder was already awake. She could see the lamp burning in the barn. She poured 2 cups and carried them out, and she found him sitting on an overturned bucket, cleaning the tack, Not because it needed it especially, but because he was the same kind of person she was. The kind who needed something to do with their hands when their mind wouldn't settle. He looked up when she came in and took the coffee without comment. "You sleep?" she said. "Some." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "You?" "Some." She sat on the edge of the grain box and looked at the gray mare in the stall. The horse turned her head and regarded Lenora with the mild, interested expression of an animal that has learned to read human moods and has chosen not to involve herself in them. "We should leave by 6. Owsley said he'd meet us on the Millhaven Road, the junction at the old miller's post. "He'll be there?" "He said he would." Calder paused. "I think he means it." He had that look. What look? The look of someone who has made a decision they should have made a long time ago and is both relieved and terrified by it. He drank his coffee. "I know that look pretty well." She didn't push that. The morning was quiet enough that she could hear the cattle shifting in the south pasture, the small sounds of the farm waking up unhurried, ordinary, the same sounds it had made every morning of her life. It was strange to sit in the middle of something this serious and have the farm just continuing to be itself around her. "If Beatrice takes the case," Lenora said, "how long before it goes anywhere?" "Hard to say. Weeks, at minimum. Possibly longer if Kincaid's attorneys push back hard, and they will." He set the coffee down and picked up the leather strap he'd been working. "The foreclosure is the immediate problem. If the bank moves on your loan before we can get a legal hold in place, he won't need to wait for the land fraud case." "Hendricks at the bank. You said Owsley confirmed Kincaid, pressured him to flag your account." "He confirmed it. He heard it directly." She looked at her hands. The left one had stiffened again in the night, it always did. The cold hours contracting the healing skin across the palm so that every morning started with 20 minutes of careful movement before she had something close to full use of it. If Beatrice can demonstrate that the loan acceleration was directed by Kincaid as part of a coordinated scheme, then the foreclosure is legally compromised, Calder said. "Yes, that's the argument." He looked at her. "It's a good argument. But it needs to be made fast." She nodded and stood up, working her left hand open and closed, slow and deliberate, watching the motion like it was something happening to someone else. It wasn't exactly painful anymore, more like a persistent tightness, a reminder written into the tissue of her palm that she couldn't fold away or file in a desk drawer. "I'm going to feed the stock," she said. "Be ready in an hour." They were on the road by 6:15, which was close enough. The morning was cooler than recent days, not cool exactly, just less aggressively hot, a thin, high overcast that cut the sun's edge without blocking it entirely. Lenora rode her bay gelding, and Calder rode the gray mare, and they went at a steady pace that the horses could hold for the distance. The Millhaven Road ran east through scrubland and low hills, and it was empty this early, just a red dirt track cutting through the dry grass, with the occasional cedar brake throwing morning shade across the path. They found Owsley at the miller's junction a little before 7. He was there already, sitting his horse with his ledger books wrapped in oilcloth and tied across his saddlebag. And he had the look Calder had described a man who has decided something and isn't going to undecide it, but isn't entirely comfortable either. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Lenora looked at his saddlebag. "You have everything?" 7 years of records. He patted the oilcloth package. "Payment ledgers, correspondence files, acquisition memos. Everything I kept copies of." A pause. "It's more than I realized when I packed it. 7 years is a lot of paper." They rode east together, 3 across on the wide part of the road and single file where it narrowed. And the conversation was sparse. The way conversation is when people are each carrying something heavy and have decided to just carry it rather than talk about it. Lenora thought about her father most of the way. Harold Ashcombe had ridden this same road, had gone to town on errands and come back, had looked at the same scrubland and the same hills and known or suspected, or feared that something was happening around him that he couldn't fully see, couldn't fully prove, couldn't fight in any way he knew how. And he'd done what he could, which was tuck a letter in a desk drawer and tell his daughter that the land had more in it than it showed, and trust that she'd be able to do something with that when the time came. She hoped she was doing something with it. Beatrice Hollowell's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Millhaven's Main Street, above a dry goods store, with a hand-lettered sign on the door that said Hollowell Attorney at Law in plain block letters, nothing decorative about it. The staircase was narrow, and the door at the top was heavier than it looked, and when Lenora pushed it open, she found a woman of about 40 sitting behind a desk covered in organized stacks of documents, writing in the margin of something with a red pencil and not looking up. "Sit down," Beatrice Hollowell said. "I'll be with you in a moment." They sat, all three of them. Lenora in the center chair, Calder to her left, Osley to her right, and the small office arranged itself around them with the comfortable disorder of a space that is genuinely used rather than arranged for impression. Beatrice finished her note, capped the pencil, and looked up. She was a compact woman with gray, threading through dark hair she kept pinned efficiently. And she had the particular quality of attention that very good lawyers develop, the kind that takes in a room in a single sweep and sorts what it finds before the conversation has properly started. Her eyes moved across the three of them, stopped briefly on Lenora's hands. Moved on. "Miss Ashcombe," she said, "I've heard your name. Your father's land case came across my desk. 3 years ago I never got the call to take it, but I read the brief." "He came to you?" Lenora said. He inquired. Then he stopped inquiring. "I assumed he'd found another avenue or decided not to pursue it." She looked at the three of them. Apparently it was the first option, not the second. "What do you have?" They laid it out. Lenora talked and Osley talked, and Calder filled in the legal framework of what he understood from his investigation of Vane's operation, and Beatrice listened without interrupting, which Lenora appreciated because interrupting people mid-explanation was how lawyers signaled that they were smarter than you. And Beatrice didn't appear to need to signal that. She read the letter from Harold's desk. She read Merritt Dunbar's notebook. She went through Osley's ledger pages with the care of someone who knows exactly what she's looking for, and is surprised only about the specific details, not the shape of things. After 40 minutes, she set everything down on the desk in a neat stack and looked at the window and was quiet long enough that Lenora started to feel the particular dread of a silence that might be going somewhere bad. "This is a coordinated land fraud scheme," Beatrice said. "Multiple properties. Deliberate concealment of material value from sellers. Bank pressure coordinated with the acquisition strategy." She looked at Osley. "Your testimony about the payment ledgers is the connective tissue. Without you, the documents are circumstantial. With you, they're a pattern." "I know," Osley said. "You're willing to testify under oath." "Yes." She looked at Calder. "And you, what's your connection to Silas Vane?" "I investigated his operation in Kansas. I gathered evidence. The evidence disappeared in a fire, and I was charged with arson." He met her eyes directly. "I didn't start it. There's an active warrant." "There is. That makes you a complicated witness." "I know. But you have direct knowledge of Vane's operational methods, and if Kincaid has used the same methods here, which this documentation strongly suggests, then the connection between the two operations is itself evidence." She tapped the desk once. "I need to write to the Territorial Land Office today. I also need to contact the federal court about jurisdiction. The warrant complicates things, but a federal investigation of Kincaid that uncovers his connection to Vane may provide the mechanism to revisit the arson case." She looked at Calder steadily. "I'm not promising anything on that. I'm saying it's possible." "I understand," he said. She turned to Lenora. "The foreclosure, when is your next payment due?" 38 days. "And you believe the loan acceleration was directed by Kincaid through Hendricks?" "Osley heard him give the instruction directly," Lenora said. Beatrice looked at Osley. "I was in the room," Osley confirmed. "Kincaid told Hendricks to flag the Ashcombe account for early review. He said, I remember the exact words because they bothered me. He said, 'She's going to need a reason to move, so give her one.'" The room was very quiet for a moment. "That," Beatrice said, "is what we call a gift." She picked up her pencil. "I'll file for an emergency injunction against the foreclosure proceedings on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. That buys time. Then we build the land fraud case." She looked at Lenora. "This will not be comfortable. Kincaid has resources and he will use them. His attorneys will challenge every document. They will try to discredit your witnesses. They will look for anything that can be used to undermine the chain of evidence." "I know," Lenora said. "You're not going to be able to keep this quiet. Once I file, the whole county will know there's a legal action against Kincaid." "Then the whole county will know," Lenora said. Beatrice looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. "All right," she said. "Leave me the originals. I'll make copies and return the originals to you. Keep them somewhere safe." "They're safe," Lenora said. They rode back to Red Willow by early afternoon, and the overcast had thickened while they were in Millhaven. the sky going the color of old wool. Osley split off at the junction with his oilcloth bundle, heading back to Denton Creek, and Lenora watched him go and hoped that she had not just made his life considerably worse. "He'll be all right," Calder said. He was watching the same direction. "You don't know that." "No." He turned back to the road. "But he's made his choice. That counts for something." They were 2 miles from Red Willow when Calder's gray mare shifted abruptly, skipping sideways on the road for no reason that Lenora could immediately see, and then she smelled it. Smoke. She looked toward the farm. The sky above where Red Willow should be had a darkness to it that was not cloud. She put her heels to the bay gelding before she'd finished thinking, and the horse jumped forward, and she heard Calder behind her doing the same. And they covered the last 2 miles at a run that was reckless on the dry, rutted road, and she didn't care. She came through the gate and saw the barn. The north end of it was fully engaged orange and black, and roaring in a way that made the air in front of it shimmer, and the fire had gotten into the hay stored in the loft, which meant it was feeding fast and climbing. She pulled the gelding up hard, and he danced, and she was off him before he'd fully stopped, her hands screaming when she hit the ground, but she was already moving toward the barn door. Calder came in behind her and was off his horse and passed her in 3 steps. "The horses," she said. "I know, stay back." She didn't stay back. She went to the far side where the smaller animals were the 2 goats, the remaining laying hens in their coop, the equipment she couldn't afford to replace, and she started moving things away from the fire's edge while Calder went into the smoke for the horses. It was not heroic. It was ugly and loud and hot, and she could barely see through the smoke, and her left hand refused to grip properly when she needed it most. And she dropped 2 things and had to pick them up again, and the goats were panicked, and one of them bit her forearm hard enough to leave a bruise before she got it tied to the fence post away from the fire. Calder brought the horses out. Both of them, the gray mare from the near stall and her father's old roan that she'd kept even though the horse was too old for real work, brought it out last, coughing hard, the horse's eyes white and rolling, but out. He led them to the far fence and tied them and came back, and they stood together watching the barn burn, and there was nothing to do about it, except make sure it didn't jump to the house. It didn't. The wind was light and going the wrong direction for the fire to spread, and by the time the structure had burned down to its bones, the house was untouched, and the livestock were all accounted for. And the equipment she'd managed to pull out was scattered across the yard at odd angles, like an interrupted thought. She sat down on the ground, not gracefully. She sat down because her legs decided they were done, and the ground was right there. And she put her wrapped hands on her knees and looked at what was left of the barn her father had built in 1871 with 2 hired hands and a borrowed team of oxen. Calder sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be there. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He just sat there in the dirt and the ash smell and waited to see what she was going to do next. What she did next surprised her. She laughed. Not the laughing of someone who finds something funny, but the kind that comes up from deep in the chest when you've been holding a weight for so long, that when something shifts, the release goes sideways, a short, hard sound that she caught immediately, pressing her lips together. "He burned it," she said. "Yes, he burned my father's barn because he's frightened of what I have." Calder looked at her. "He burned it," she said again, and this time there was no dark laughter in it, just a kind of cold clarity that settled into her bones and made her feel strangely steady. "Garrett is right. Merritt is right. Those documents are right. If Kincaid wasn't terrified, he would have let me go through foreclosure. Clean, legal, safe for him." She looked at the smoking ruin. "But he couldn't wait. He needed to scare me right now, tonight, which means he knows we went to Millhaven." Calder nodded slowly. "He has someone watching. He has someone watching." She pushed herself back to her feet not smoothly. It took 2 tries, her left arm not cooperating, and stood looking at the ruined barn. "That means he probably knows we saw Beatrice. Which means the injunction filing is going to surprise him, but not shock him. Is that bad? No." Calder stood. "It might be good. A man who's already frightened and acts impulsively burns a barn he shouldn't have burned is a man who makes more mistakes when the pressure increases." He looked at her. "Are you hurt?" "Goat bit me. Are you hurt otherwise?" She took stock, honestly. Her hands had both taken additional stress. The left one was throbbing hard, and the right had a new raw patch where she'd scraped it on the equipment. Her lungs felt heavy with smoke. Her knees were dirty, and one was bruised from the ground. "I'm functional," she said. Your hands will survive. She looked at him. What about you? He had ash in his hair and a burn mark on the back of his left forearm, not serious, but the skin was red and would blister. She'd seen worse. He waved it off when she looked at it. Go inside, he said. I'll start clearing what can be cleared. I'll help, Lenora. He said her name quietly. Go inside. Wash your hands. Sit down for 20 minutes. I'll start clearing. She opened her mouth to argue and stopped. She was tired enough that her own arguments were losing their edges, and 20 minutes wasn't the same as quitting. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands, both of them, the scars on the left and the new damage on the right, and she thought about Vernon Kincaid riding away from this farm. Tonight, he'd won something. Believing that a burned barn meant she was done. She thought about what her father would say. He wouldn't say anything dramatic. He'd probably sit down across from her and drink his coffee and say something like, well, now we know how scared he is. And then he'd go back outside and start planning what to do next. She got up, went back outside, helped Calder clear. Marshal Everett Kane came to the farm the next morning. She was not entirely surprised. A barn fire was the kind of thing that brought a lawman not immediately, because a lawman's time was divided across a large territory, and one woman's barn fire was not the top of any priority list. But Kane was methodical, and she'd already established that he was more careful than his easy manner suggested. He looked at the ruin. He walked the perimeter of it. He crouched down at the north end where the fire had started and looked at the ground with an expression she couldn't read. Then he came to the porch where she was waiting. You have any idea how it started? He said. I have a strong suspicion, she said. I don't have proof. He looked at her steadily. You want to tell me the suspicion? She told him. Not everything, not the documents, not Beatrice, not Osley's testimony, but the basic shape of it. Kincaid's repeated offers, the accelerating pressure, the fact that she had recently been asking questions about survey filings, the timing of the fire relative to her trip to Millhaven. Kane listened with his hands in his coat pockets and his face giving nothing away. That's a significant accusation, he said. I know. Against a significant man in this county. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Miss Ashcombe, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate the same in return. All right. The man you hired, Fenwick, he was here when the fire started? We were both away from the farm, she said carefully. We came back and found it burning, both of you, away together, riding back from Millhaven. What was in Millhaven? She held his gaze. We consulted an attorney. Something shifted in Kane's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a set of pieces clicking into an order. He hadn't expected them to reach this quickly. Beatrice Hollowell, he said. Yes. He looked at the ruined barn again, then at the ground in front of it, then at the sky like he was checking the weather, then back at her. I need to speak with your man, he said. He's in the south pasture, she said. I'll come with you. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary, she said. I'm coming anyway. Kane almost smiled. He walked, and she walked beside him, and they found Calder at the south fence, mending what the night before had left. Because when you live on a working farm, there is no pause for crisis. The animals don't know about crisis. The fences don't know about crisis, and so you mend fences. He saw them coming and stopped what he was doing and waited. He had the particular quality of a man who has learned that running is worse than standing still, who has learned it the hard way, through the specific consequences of running before, and has made peace with the alternative. Fenwick, Kane said. Marshal, I have some questions about last night and about some other matters. I figured, Calder said. The two men looked at each other. There was a conversation happening between them that Lenora could hear the shape of, but not the exact words, the particular shorthand of men who each know what the other's job is and are trying to decide how much to respect each other. The warrant, Kane said. I've been doing some correspondence on it. The original investigation in Kansas had some irregularities that my counterpart there is now looking at. Calder was very still. What kind of irregularities? The witness who placed you at the fire scene. He had financial connections to Silas Vane that weren't disclosed at the time of his testimony. Kane watched Calder's face. I'm not telling you the warrant is cleared. It isn't. But I'm telling you the picture is more complicated than the original filing suggested. Lenora watched Calder absorb that. She watched him hold it the way you hold something fragile that you've needed for a long time and aren't sure you trust yet. Who told you that? Calder said. My counterpart in Wichita has been building a case on Vane's operation for 2 years, Kane said. Your name came up as someone who tried to expose him and got burned for it, literally, apparently. A pause. No one's told you this before, because no one knew where you were. I was moving, Calder said. You stopped moving, Kane said. Here. His eyes moved briefly to Lenora, then back to Calder. The south pasture was quiet. The cattle moved slowly in the dry grass. The fence post Calder had been working on stood half repaired beside him, the wire hanging loose and waiting. The fire last night, Kane said. You didn't start it. We weren't here when it started, Calder said. We have the length of the road to Millhaven and Beatrice Hollowell's office log to confirm that. I know. Kane put his hands back in his pockets. I also know that fires don't start themselves in the section of a barn that's furthest from the lamp line in the stove. He looked toward the ruined structure. Someone started it, and whoever started it wanted it to read as intimidation. Does it? Lenora said. Kane looked at her. Does it intimidate you? No, she said. It tells me how frightened he is. Kane held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, a slow, single movement that carried more weight than it should from a man who was professionally non-committal. I'm going to pay a call on Vernon Kincaid this afternoon, he said. I'm going to ask him about the fire. I'm going to ask him about survey filings for properties in the southern tier. And I'm going to let him know that there's a federal investigation into land practices in this county that will require his full cooperation. He looked at both of them. You didn't hear that from me. Hear what? Lenora said. Kane almost smiled again. He walked back toward the house and she watched him go, and then she looked at Calder, who was looking at the place where the marshal had been standing with an expression she'd come to recognize the particular face of a man who is recalculating the odds and not entirely sure whether they've improved or just shifted. He's on our side, she said. It wasn't entirely a question. He's on the law's side, Calder said, which right now is close to the same thing. Is that enough? He turned back to the fence, picked up the wire. We'll find out. She left him to the fence and went back to the house. And on the way she stopped at the ruin of the barn, stood at its edge, and looked at the black bones of it, the charred posts still standing at odd angles, the smell of it thick and particular. There was her father's saddle post in the far corner. The fire had caught it at the base, but not consumed it, and the leather saddle itself had been pulled out by Calder the night before, along with the horses. She'd put it back on the post in the dark, when everything had settled, without thinking about it, just putting it back where it belonged. She went to it now, worked the stitching on the side panel with her right hand, the left, not reliable enough for fine work this morning. The notebook was still there. The letter was still there. She pressed the leather back into place and stood in the shell of the burned barn with the documents her father had never gotten to use pressed against her hip in a fold of leather. And she thought, he couldn't do it. He knew and he couldn't do it. And maybe that wasn't failure. Maybe he was just holding it until she was ready. That afternoon, something happened that she hadn't expected. Neighbors came. Not all at once first. It was just Della Pruitt from the adjacent property, who arrived in her wagon with a covered pot and a look on her face that said she'd heard about the barn and had decided that hearing about it was not sufficient. She said nothing particularly elaborate. She set the pot on the porch, looked at the ruin, and said, "That wasn't lightning." "No," Lenora said. "You need help clearing the site? I'd be grateful." By mid-afternoon, there were 6 people in her yard. The Pruitts, old man Taggart from the North Road who'd brought his 2 adult sons, and a woman named Clara Ferris, whose husband had sold his property to Kincaid 18 months ago and moved his family to the edge of the county. Clara had come alone. She stood at the periphery while the men worked at the debris pile, and when Lenora came near her, she said quietly, "My husband didn't want to sell. He said so. But the bank called the note early, and we didn't have a choice." She looked at the ruined barn. "We always thought it was just bad luck." Lenora looked at her. It wasn't bad luck. Clara was quiet. "I know. I think I've known for a while." She looked at the yard, at the people working in it. What can we do? What she was asking, Lenora understood, was not about clearing debris. "There may be legal proceedings," Lenora said carefully. "An attorney in Millhaven is looking at what happened to several families in this county. If your family was pressured out of a property, if the bank was made to accelerate your loan, without legitimate cause, you may be owed something." Clara Ferris looked at her with an expression that was complicated hope and anger, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been wronged and spent months telling themselves they imagined it. "You'd have to be willing to talk to the attorney," Lenora said, "and to be honest about what you know." "I'm willing," Clara said. Calder came up from the debris pile, ash on his hands and his hair, and saw the two women talking and had the good sense to go get water from the well instead of coming closer. Lenora noticed and appreciated it. She looked at her farm, the people working in it, the ruined barn, the house standing untouched, the north pump going steadily, the cattle in the pasture. Kincaid had burned the barn because he was afraid. He should be more afraid now, because she was not alone on this land anymore, not tonight, not in the way she'd been alone for 14 months. There were people in this yard who understood now, or were beginning to understand, what had been done to them. And tomorrow, somewhere in Millhaven, Beatrice Hollowell was writing letters to the Territorial Land Office with the documentation that would start something that could not be unstarted. Lenora went to help clear the debris. Her hands hurt. They were always going to hurt. Probably the scars were permanent. The left hand would have its tight mornings for years to come, and there would always be the days when the weather changed and the old cuts reminded her. She cleared debris anyway, because the barn was going to have to be rebuilt, and the farm was going to have to survive the next 38 days until Beatrice's injunction could hold the foreclosure, and there was evidence still to be protected and a case still to be built. And Vernon Kincaid had made a catastrophic mistake when he thought burning a woman's barn would break her. What it had done instead was make it impossible to go back to simply surviving. He had taken away her option of keeping her head down, of quietly gathering evidence and hoping nothing escalated. He had made it a fight in the open now, and Lenora Ashcombe had been fighting in the open, visibly, bodily, without the option of disappearing every day of her life on this frontier. The sun went down, and the neighbors went home, and Calder made supper, and she ate it at the kitchen table without tasting it much. And afterward she sat on the porch, and the night came in around her. She was not broken, she was not even close. And somewhere in the dark on the other side of this county, Vernon Kincaid would be sitting in his comfortable house looking over his options and understanding, if he was smart enough, that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Beatrice Hollowell filed the injunction on a Tuesday. Lenora knew, because Beatrice sent a rider with a note that arrived before breakfast, 3 sentences. No preamble, exactly the kind of communication she'd come to expect from the woman. Injunction filed this morning. Foreclosure proceedings suspended pending hearing. Expect response from Kincaid's attorneys within the week. Lenora read it twice, then set it on the kitchen table and poured her coffee and sat down with it the way she sat down with most things that mattered quietly, without performing anything for anyone, just letting it settle into her. The foreclosure was suspended, not resolved, not won. Suspended, which meant the ground had shifted, but not stopped moving, and the next 30 days were going to be as hard as the 30 before them, in different ways. But suspended was something. Suspended meant she had time, and time was what she'd been most desperate for since the moment she understood what Kincaid was doing. Calder came in from the morning feeding, and she handed him the note without speaking. He read it and handed it back. Beatrice moves fast, he said. She does. Lenora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The left hand's morning stiffness was bad today, rain coming maybe, though the sky outside was still clear. Her hands had become their own weather system, reading pressure changes in the tissue before they showed anywhere else. Kincaid will know by afternoon. He probably already knows. Calder got his own coffee and sat across from her. Men like him have people at the courthouse, so he'll be angry. He'll be calculating, Calder said. There's a difference. Angry men burn barns. Calculating men hire attorneys and look for weaknesses. He paused. He's going to go after the documents. Try to establish they were obtained improperly. He'll go after Osley, try to discredit him as a disgruntled former employee with a grievance. And he'll go after me. The warrant. It's the cleanest lever he has. If he can get Kane to execute it, he removes me from the county before I can testify to anything. And a man who's been convicted of arson in another state doesn't make a compelling witness even from a distance. Lenora looked at her coffee. Kane told you the Wichita investigation was looking at the warrant. He did. But looking at and clearing are different things. That could take months. Is there anything we can do to speed it? Calder was quiet for a moment. There might be one person. A man named Delford Chase. He was a survey agent who worked tangentially with Vane's operation. He knew I hadn't started that fire. He told me so directly, 3 days after it happened, then disappeared before anyone official could get to him. He set down his cup. If he's still findable, and if he'd repeat what he told me under oath, That would go a long way toward the arson case. Where is he? Last I heard, Abilene. That was a year and a half ago. She looked at him across the table. Can we reach him without going ourselves? Kane could, if he's willing to send a wire and follow up on the response. Then we ask Kane. Today. She rode to town alone that morning. Calder stayed at the farm, partly because his presence in town was itself a provocation right now, and partly because the farm needed someone on it at all times until this was resolved. The barn was gone and the livestock was scattered across makeshift enclosures, and the whole operation was running on improvisation and stubbornness. She found Kane at the sheriff's office. He was using the deputy's desk, since the county didn't maintain a separate federal accommodation, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been expecting her and was mildly pleased to be right. You've heard, he said. Beatrice sent a rider. She sat down across from him. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. There's a man named Delford Chase. He was in Abilene a year and a half ago. He witnessed events related to the fire that Calder Fenwick was charged with in Kansas, and his testimony would support the case for revisiting the warrant. She looked at Kane steadily. Would you be willing to send a wire to the Abilene Sheriff's Office and ask them to locate him? Kane leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. You're asking me to actively work toward clearing the man who's living on your property, and who I am technically obligated to arrest on site. I'm asking you to pursue evidence that the warrant is based on false testimony, she said, which you told Calder yourself was being looked at by your counterpart in Wichita. I did say that, so I'm asking you to be consistent. He looked at her for a moment, with something between amusement and respect. Miss Ashcombe, you negotiate like someone who's done it before. I've been bargaining over feed prices with hostile men for 14 months, she said. Some of it transfers. He almost laughed, a small sound, quickly controlled. He pulled a telegraph form from the desk drawer. I'll send to Abilene, and I'll copy the Wichita office so they know we're looking. I can't promise Chase is there or that he'll talk. I know. But if he's there and you find him, will you pursue it? Yes, Kane said. I'll pursue it. He picked up his pen. Then, without looking up, I went to see Kincaid yesterday, like I said I would. She waited. He was polite, cooperative on the surface. Denied any knowledge of the barn fire. Said it was probably a lamp accident or vandalism by transients. Kane wrote as he talked efficient, not letting the conversation slow his hand. His attorney was present, man named Prescott from San Antonio. Expensive suit. Which tells me Prescott was already in county before I showed up, which means Kincaid knew the legal action was coming before I arrived. He has someone watching Beatrice's office, Lenora said. Or he has someone inside the courthouse. Kane looked up. I want you to be careful, not frightened careful. There's a difference. This man has spent years building a network in this county, and he will use every piece of it. I know. The people around you, the neighbors who came to help after the fire. Della Pruitt, Taggart, do you trust them as much as I trust anyone? Clara Ferris came to you. Lenora looked at him. You know about that. Small county. He returned to his writing. Her husband's case may be the cleanest example of the accelerated loan tactic. If Beatrice can add their situation to the filing, it strengthens the pattern argument significantly. I'll talk to Beatrice. Do that. He finished the telegraph form and set it aside. One more thing. Kincaid's attorney Prescott filed a motion this morning challenging the authenticity of the documents cited in Beatrice's injunction. He's claiming the land office notebook was improperly obtained and should be excluded. Lenora absorbed that. Merritt gave it to me voluntarily. Prescott will argue coercion. He'll say you pressured a county employee to provide confidential records. Kane watched her face. Merritt will need to testify to the circumstances of the handover. Voluntarily, clearly, without apparent pressure. Will he? That depends on Merritt Dunbar, Kane said, and on how much he's been gotten to since you spoke with him. She rode directly from the sheriff's office to Merritt's house, not the land office, the house again, the same route as before. Though this time it felt like she was retracing steps in a situation that had changed significantly under her feet. Merritt's wife answered the door again, and her expression this time was not careful neutrality but something closer to fear, which told Lenora before she was inside that something had happened. Merritt was in the sitting room. He looked smaller than the last time she'd seen him, not physically, but in the way a person looks when they've been worked on by something that took air out of them. He came himself, Merritt said when she sat down. Not one of his men this time. Kincaid himself came to the office this morning. Lenora kept her face still. What did he say? He was very measured. That's the word for it. He sat across from my counter and spoke quietly and never raised his voice, and said that he understood I had been approached by certain parties who were making unfounded accusations against his business practices, and that he hoped I hadn't allowed myself to be drawn into providing materials that might be used inappropriately. Merritt's hands were on his knees, and he was looking at them. He said he had always valued our professional relationship. He said he hoped nothing had occurred that would complicate my continued employment. That's a threat, Lenora said. Yes, Merritt said. It was. It was an extremely polite threat delivered by a man sitting in my office at 9 a.m. who knew exactly what he was doing. Merritt. She leaned forward slightly. You gave me that notebook voluntarily. You knew what you were giving me and why. That hasn't changed. It hasn't changed, he agreed. I know that. But he's sitting across from me and you are not, and that has a weight to it that I'm finding difficult to. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I know, she said. And she did know. She knew exactly what it felt like to be alone in a room with Vernon Kincaid's certainty, his absolute confidence that he had already won. She'd been in that room. She'd stood in her own yard with his folded paper offers and felt the particular gravity of a powerful man's patience. The attorney Beatrice Hollowell is going to need you to testify, Lenora said, about how you came to give me the notebook, that you did it without coercion, of your own will, because you believed it was right. Merritt was quiet for a long time. His wife appeared in the doorway, not interrupting, just present, the way spouses are when they're tracking a conversation that matters to their family's safety. Lenora looked at her briefly. The woman met her eyes and didn't look away. The wire came through this morning, Merritt said finally, from the Territorial Land Office. They've received Beatrice's brief and opened a preliminary inquiry. He looked up. I found out because it's my job to process incoming official correspondence. It came across my counter at 8:15. Kincaid was in my office at 9. The sequence of that landed in the room like a stone. He knew within 45 minutes, Lenora said. Someone wired him from the land office in Austin the moment the inquiry was opened. Merritt exhaled slowly, which means he has a contact there too. Lenora sat with that. The reach of it was wider than she'd understood, not just county-level connections, but contacts in the territorial capital. Men paid to watch for his name and notify him when it appeared in official correspondence. Merritt, she said, I'm going to ask you one direct question and I want an honest answer. He looked at her. Are you going to testify? A long silence. His wife in the doorway. The sitting room quiet and dusty in the morning light. Your father came to me 3 years ago, Merritt said, and I told him I couldn't help him. I had the information and I told him I couldn't help. He looked at his hands again. He died 8 months later. I've thought about that more times than I can count. He stood up. Yes, he said, I'll testify. She was back at Red Willow by noon, and Calder was at the fence line, and she told him everything in sequence, walking beside him as he worked, because standing still while recounting trouble always made it feel larger than it was. He listened and moved and listened. Kincaid has a contact at the Territorial Land Office, he said when she finished. It looks that way. That's actually useful to us. She looked at him. How? Because Beatrice can argue it establishes a pattern of interference. A man who has cultivated contacts inside the regulatory system that oversees the very land acquisitions he's perpetrating isn't just defrauding individual sellers, he's compromising the oversight mechanism itself. He set down the wire he was working. That moves this from a civil land dispute to something with more federal teeth. She needs to know about this today. Yes. He looked at her. Can you ride back to Millhaven? She thought about the 18 miles each way, her hands in their current state, the afternoon heat. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early, he nodded. Then there's something else. His tone changed in the way she'd learned to read a slight flattening, not evasion, but precision. The way he sounded when he was about to say something he'd been sitting with for a while. While you were in town, Taggart's younger son came by, Nathan. He said there's talk in town about the injunction. People know about the filing and people are talking. Some of it's bad. There are men who think you've overstepped, that you're causing trouble that'll hurt the whole county's relationship with Kincaid's supply operation. He met her eyes. But some of it is different. There are families who had dealings with Kincaid's land purchases who are starting to ask questions. Nathan said his father remembers a neighbor who sold 3 years ago, a man named Birch. moved his family to Fort Worth, and the circumstances of that sale have always sat wrong with Taggart. More affected families, Lenora said. More potential witnesses. He picked up the wire again. Beatrice needs names. I'll get names. She spent that afternoon doing something she'd never been particularly comfortable with, asking for help. Going from farm to farm on the surrounding properties, the Pruitts, Taggart's place, 2 other neighbors she knew well enough to approach, and sitting in their kitchens and on their porches, and asking them, carefully and directly, whether they had ever had dealings with Kincaid or the bank that hadn't felt right, whether their loan terms had changed unexpectedly, whether anyone had approached them about selling, or pressured them, or made them feel the outcome was inevitable. It was uncomfortable in the specific way that asking for honesty about private financial matters always is. People's money troubles were their own shame to carry. In the frontier way of thinking, and opening them up to a neighbor felt like exposure. She understood that because she'd felt it herself. She'd wrapped her own financial desperation, incompetence, and stubbornness for 14 months rather than say the words "I need help" to anyone who might hear them. But she asked anyway, and people talked. Della Pruitt's husband, it turned out, had been approached twice by a man representing Kincaid's interests, not Kincaid directly. But an intermediary, and the second approach had coincided with a bank letter about their account that didn't match the loan terms they'd originally signed. They'd managed to cover the discrepancy, and the intermediary had stopped coming, but Della had kept the original loan document and the subsequent bank letter both, because she was the kind of woman who kept things. Old Taggart confirmed what his son had said about his neighbor Birch, and added that Birch had told him, the week before he sold and left, that the bank had demanded full repayment of a note that wasn't due for another year. And when Birch had gone to argue it, Hendricks had shown him a clause in the fine print of his original agreement that seemed to have been added after the fact. Birch hadn't had the money to fight it. He'd sold and left. The Ferris woman, Clara Lenora, drove out to her place that afternoon and found her feeding chickens in the yard and sat with her on the porch steps while the sun went sideways, and Long told her that her husband had gone to Hendricks's bank 3 times to discuss the early loan recall, and each time had been told it was bank policy and not subject to appeal. The 3rd time, Hendricks had said something that hadn't made sense then, but made sense now, mister. Kincaid has been very patient with your account. I'd take the settlement while he's still inclined to offer one. Lenora wrote all of it down in a new notebook she'd bought in town, sitting at kitchen tables and on porch steps, with the notebook on her knee and her right hand doing the work while the left rested. She was not a natural note-taker. Her hand was slower than her mind, and she kept having to abbreviate things and then write the abbreviations out in full when she got back to her wagon. But she filled 6 pages by the time she turned for home. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and organized the notes, and Calder sat across from her reading them as she finished each page. And his expression did the particular thing it did when something was both as bad as expected and somehow worse. 5 families, he said, that I found today. There are more. Taggart knows of at least 2 others who moved their families out of the county. All of them with the same pattern. Loan acceleration, pressure to sell, below-market offers from Kincaid's representatives. Same pattern, different families, different times. Spread out enough that nobody saw it as coordinated. She looked at the notes. Because they each thought it was their own bad luck. That's how it's designed, Calder said. You isolate each victim so they believe they're the only one. Takes the idea of collective action off the table before anyone thinks to try it. Well, she said, someone's thinking to try it now. She rode to Millhaven the next morning. Early, as she'd said. Calder stayed at the farm and she went alone, and Beatrice received her at the office before 8 and listened to everything without interrupting. And when Lenora finished and laid the notebook on the desk, Beatrice read it straight through in the particular focused silence of a lawyer recognizing what she has. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, not excitement exactly. Something more like the specific satisfaction of a person who builds cases the way architects build structures and has just had a keystone handed to her. 5 more families, Beatrice said, that I've spoken to. There are others. I need signed statements from each of them. And I need Della Pruitt's original loan document and the subsequent bank letter immediately. That comparison is physical evidence of document alteration, which elevates this from contractual fraud to criminal forgery. She was already writing. The Ferris woman's testimony about Hendrix's statement that's direct evidence of coordination between the bank and Kincaid. Hendrix has exposure now that I don't think he's calculated. She looked up. Have you spoken to Hendrix yourself? No, don't. Not yet. I want to approach him through proper legal channels when I'm ready, and if he's spoken to you informally first, Prescott will argue coaching. She tapped her pencil on the desk. The territorial inquiry is active. I got their acknowledgement yesterday. The contact at the land office in Austin, the one who wired Kincaid, that needs to go into my response filing today. It's material to the integrity of the proceedings. Kane is sending a wire to Abilene, Lenora said, looking for the witness who can clear Calder's warrant. Beatrice paused. If that warrant gets cleared before we go to hearing, Fenwick becomes a significantly stronger witness. His testimony about Vane's methods and their similarity to Kincaid's pattern is very powerful. Right now, Prescott can attack it through the arson case, without that hanging over him. I know, Lenora said. That's why I asked Kane. Beatrice looked at her for a moment, the same look she'd gotten in their first meeting, that adjacent to admiration thing. You've been managing a lot of moving pieces, she said. I'm a farmer, Lenora said. Everything is moving pieces. She drove back in the heat of the afternoon, the bay gelding plodding steadily under the high white sky, and she was tired in a way that had become familiar, not the exhaustion of defeat, but the exhaustion of continuous effort, of keeping a great many things from falling at once. Her hands ached. Her back ached. She was, she thought, starting to feel every single one of her 30 years in a way she hadn't at 25. But the pieces were moving, and they were moving in the right direction. She was a mile from the farm when she saw the horse tied at her gate. A good horse, black, well-maintained, with Kincaid's brand on the flank. She slowed the wagon. Her hands tightened on the reins, and then she made herself loosen them, because arriving tense was arriving at a disadvantage. She drove through the gate, and Calder was on the porch, and his face told her immediately that whatever was inside was not a pleasant surprise. He had the careful stillness of a man who has been managing a situation and is relieved to hand part of it back. Vernon Kincaid was standing in her yard, not on the porch, not at the door. In the yard, which he'd positioned himself in deliberately, she understood immediately in the yard. He had the space to look like he was at ease, like the land around him was already familiar territory. He wore his good coat despite the heat, which told her this was a calculated visit, not a hurried one. He watched her climb down from the wagon, watched her hands on the reins, the careful way she managed, with the left, and his expression was composed in that particular way of his that she'd learned to read as performance. Lenora, he said, I apologize for coming unannounced. He didn't look like he was apologizing. Vernon. She handed the reins to Calder, who'd come down from the porch, and walked toward Kincaid with her hands visible at her sides. What do you want? He glanced at Calder. Might we speak privately? No, she said. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. A small adjustment in his expression. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. He was recalculating, she realized. He'd expected her to negotiate the terms of the conversation, and she hadn't. I understand there are legal proceedings underway, he said. I want you to know that I bear you no ill will, Lenora. You're in a difficult situation, and you've made decisions based on incomplete information. That's understandable. He paused. But these proceedings are going to cause a great deal of trouble for a great many people in this county who depend on stable commercial relationships. People who work for me, suppliers, families. The families you defrauded, she said. His jaw tightened. I have not defrauded anyone. You commissioned geological surveys of properties you were simultaneously offering to purchase at prices that didn't reflect the aquifer beneath them. You used those surveys to identify value that the sellers didn't know existed. You pressured the bank to accelerate loans to force sales you couldn't obtain through fair negotiation. She held his gaze. That's fraud, Vernon. The name for it doesn't change based on how politely you delivered the offers. He was quiet for a moment. The yard was very still, just the sound of the cattle in the distance, the gate moving slightly in a thin breeze. I have an offer, he said. I know you have an offer. You always have an offer. This one is different. He reached into his coat. Not a folded paper, this time a document, several pages, folded once. He held it out. A settlement. A substantial one. Enough to rebuild your barn, clear your remaining debts, and leave you with operational capital for 3 years of improvement to this farm. in exchange for withdrawing from the legal proceedings and providing written confirmation that you received appropriate consideration for all property transactions. She looked at the document in his hand. She didn't take it. You're asking me to confirm that you treated me fairly, she said, and to help you bury what happened to the Ferris family and the Birches and Della Pruitt and everyone else you did this to. I'm asking you to be practical, he said. You are one woman running a struggling farm. The legal process you've started will take years and cost more than you have, and there is no certainty at the end of it. There's enough certainty, she said. Lenora, I'm going to tell you something, Vernon. She took one step toward him. Just one, but he held his ground. And she was glad he did, because she didn't want him to step back. She wanted him close enough to hear her clearly. The families you drove out of this county, the ones who thought it was their own bad luck and moved their children to smaller places, and spent years believing they'd failed, those people deserve an answer. Not money you control. An answer. She looked at him steadily. You can keep your settlement. He looked at her for a long moment. Then at Calder, who was standing at the edge of the porch, not forward, not aggressive, just there, present, a weight on Lenora's side of the calculation that Kincaid clearly did not enjoy. You're making a mistake, Kincaid said. His voice had lost its careful polish. Just slightly, but enough. Maybe, she said. I've made them before. This isn't one. He folded the document back into his coat. The courteous mask reassembled itself, but she could see the seams in it now, the places where the performance met the calculation underneath. I'll see you at the hearing, he said. Yes, she said. You will. He walked to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man who has ridden well-kept horses all his life, rode out without looking back. She stood in the yard and watched the gate until the sound of his horse on the road faded, and then she let herself breathe all the way out for the first time in what felt like several minutes. Calder came to stand beside her. You all right? He said. Yes. She thought about it. Yes, I actually am. He looked at the gate. He's going to come harder now. That was the last attempt at quiet resolution. Everything from here will be through his attorneys and through whatever leverage he has left. I know, the hearing could be brutal. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, then, you didn't flinch. I was flinching on the inside, she said. That's what the inside is for. He made that almost smile. She walked to the porch and sat down on the step and looked at the yard, the patched fences, the jury-rigged animal enclosures where the barn used to be, the north pump working in the distance. Everything held together with stubbornness and wire, and the particular refusal to quit that she'd inherited from a man who died believing this land had more in it than it showed. The wire came from Kane 2 days later. He brought it himself rather than sending it, which told her before she opened it that the news was significant. She read it standing in the yard with Calder beside her. Delford Chase was in Abilene. He'd been located by the sheriff there at Kane's request. He had agreed to speak to the Wichita federal office about the fire. More than that, Chase had been holding information for 2 years, waiting, as he'd told the Abilene sheriff, for someone to ask the right question. He had an affidavit from a man who'd been paid to set the fire, and that man had named the person who'd hired him, and that person was connected to Silas Vane. She lowered the wire. Chase had an affidavit, she said. Calder took the paper. Read it. His face did something she hadn't seen before, a kind of unguarded opening, very brief, before the controlled expression came back. But she saw it. The 2 years of it, the running and the warrant, and the weight of being accused of something he hadn't done, visible for just that moment before he put it back where he kept it. He kept it, Calder said. He kept it, she agreed. 2 years. His voice was not quite steady. He was waiting. People do that, she said quietly. Wait for the right moment, to be honest. It takes time to get there sometimes. He handed the wire back. This clears the warrant. Kane says the Wichita office will formally suspend it, pending the full review, which he expects to complete within 3 weeks. She folded the paper. You're not going anywhere, Calder. He looked at her. Then at the farm around them, the battered fences, the missing barn, the dry hills in the distance. I wasn't planning to, he said. The days that followed were the hardest kind, not dramatically hard, not the acute crisis of a burning barn or a confrontation in the yard, but the grinding, sustained difficulty of preparation. Beatrice needed statements from 5 families. Those families needed time to decide, to talk among themselves, to find the courage to put their names on documents that would be read in a federal proceeding by men with law degrees paid to tear them apart. Lenora went back to every one of them. She drove the wagon and tied the horse and sat in people's kitchens and waited for them to find what they had. Some of them found it easily. Clara Ferris sat straight in her kitchen chair and signed without hesitation. Della Pruitt needed an evening to discuss it with her husband, and then signed. Taggart took 3 days. He was a proud man, and signing a legal statement meant admitting he'd been taken, and that sat wrong with him, but he signed. The ones she'd never met were harder. She reached them through the network of people who knew people, through Taggart and Pruitt and the Ferris woman, and she drove distances that made her hands ache by the time she arrived. And she told the truth, which was, I can't promise you this is easy. I can promise you it's right. Merritt Dunbar gave his statement to Beatrice's office in a single afternoon visit, without anyone accompanying him, without fanfare. He arrived, he sat down, he said what he knew in a measured, clear voice, and he signed the statement and left. Beatrice sent Lenora a note afterward that said only, Dunbar was excellent, clear and unimpeachable. Prescott will not enjoy cross-examining him. Hendricks at the bank was the piece Lenora had been least sure about. But Beatrice had approached him through proper channels, a formal letter delivered by a territorial court officer, not a conversation over a counter, and whatever Prescott had advised him. Hendricks had apparently done his own calculation about which side of this proceeding was the safer one to be on when the dust settled. He provided a written statement acknowledging that he had received communications from Vernon Kincaid requesting the acceleration of specific loan accounts, and that he had acted on those requests in a manner inconsistent with the standard terms of the loans involved. He did not use the word fraud. He didn't need to. The statement said what it said. Kincaid's attorney Prescott filed 3 motions in the week before the hearing, one challenging the admissibility of the geological survey evidence, one challenging Owsley's standing as a witness, one requesting a continuance of 60 days on the grounds of insufficient preparation time. Beatrice opposed all 3. The hearing judge denied all 3. The night before the hearing, Lenora sat on the porch alone for a long time. Calder came out eventually and sat on the step below her, not beside her, below, and she understood that this was deliberate, that he was putting himself at a different level so she could look past him or at him as she chose. How are you? He said. She thought about the honest answer. Tired, not afraid. She looked at the stars. I keep thinking about the families. Whether the hearing actually gives them something, whether it's enough. It won't give them back what they lost, he said. That's the honest thing. No, but it gives them the acknowledgement that what happened wasn't their failure, that it was done to them deliberately by someone who believed they could get away with it. He paused. That matters. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters. She was quiet. Then you've been doing that a lot, saying the hard, honest thing instead of the comfortable thing. Is that wrong? No, she said. It's why I trust you. He looked at the yard for a while. At the space where the barn used to be the cleared ground, the salvaged timber stacked to the side, the beginning of what would eventually become a new structure. It was going to take months. It was going to take money she didn't entirely have yet, and labor she'd have to negotiate for, and all the stubborn incremental work that rebuilding anything requires. After tomorrow, he said, whatever happens at the hearing, I want to talk to you about something. She looked at the back of his head. About what? About what comes next. For me. For the farm. He seemed to choose his words carefully. I'm not going anywhere. I said that. But I want to say it more clearly, when the immediate emergency isn't sitting on top of everything. She understood what he was saying, or she thought she did. She didn't push it, not tonight, not with the hearing in the morning, and the weight of the last month still pressing on everything. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She went inside eventually and lay on her bed in the dark, and she thought about her father, about Harold Ashcombe, who had found a letter and hidden it, and told his daughter that the land had more in it than it showed, and who had trusted her with a fight he hadn't known how to finish himself. She was going to finish it tomorrow. She was going to walk into that hearing room with Beatrice Hollowell and Garrett Owsley and Merritt Dunbar and the signed statements of 5 families and the testimony of a federal marshal and a man whose warrant was in the process of being cleared, and she was going to lay everything on the table that needed to be laid on it. She was not going to be smooth or perfect about it. She was going to have bandaged hands and a burned-down barn and 14 months of exhaustion written into her face, and she was going to be exactly what she was, a large woman in frontier clothing who refused to be run off her. Father's land, and it was going to have to be enough. She closed her eyes. Outside, the north pump ran steadily in the dark. The water beneath the ground moved through stone and waited, and Red Willow held its breath one more night. The hearing room in Millhaven was not a grand space. It was a room above the county clerk's office, wooden floors, 4 windows, 2 long tables arranged facing a raised desk where the territorial hearing officer sat. It smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular staleness of a room that gets used for serious things and not much else. There were maybe 30 people seated along the walls when Lenora walked in, which was more than she'd expected. Word had moved through the county faster than she'd anticipated, or maybe people had simply decided that whatever happened in this room today was worth seeing for themselves. She walked in with Beatrice beside her, and Osley and Merritt Dunbar behind, and she did not look around for Kincaid immediately, because looking for him would mean he was already occupying her attention before anything had been said, and she refused to give him that. She sat at the left table. Beatrice arranged her documents with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been in more rooms like this than she can count and stopped being nervous about them years ago. Osley sat to Lenora's right with his oilcloth-wrapped ledgers on the table in front of him. Merritt sat at the end, his spectacles clean, his hands flat on the table, looking like a man who has decided something and is holding the decision with both hands so it doesn't get away from him. She looked at Kincaid then. He was at the right table with Prescott beside him, Prescott immaculate and arranged. Kincaid in his good coat, with his hands folded in front of him, and his expression composed in the way she'd seen it, composed a dozen times in her yard, and at her fence, and in the middle of her life. He looked, she thought, like a man who had walked into rooms like this before, and understood how to perform patience while waiting for the performance to end in his favor. He looked at her once. Just once, a brief, measuring look, and then he returned his attention to Prescott, who was leaning in to say something quietly. The hearing officer was a compact man named Aldous Webb, assigned from the Territorial Land Court, who arranged his own papers and looked over the room, with the professional neutrality of a man who has heard a great many claim to have been wronged and has developed a method for sorting the ones who actually were. Beatrice spoke first. She laid the case out, in order not dramatically, not with flourish, but with the specific clarity of someone who has built a structure and is walking you through it room by room so you understand what holds up what: the geological surveys, the pattern of acquisitions, the loan accelerations coordinated through Hendricks, the documented communication between Kincaid and the Aldridge survey firm, Osley's testimony, Merritt's testimony, the 5 family statements, the Wichita Federal Office's preliminary findings on the connection between Kincaid's methods and Silas Fiend's Kansas operation. She spoke for 40 minutes. Webb asked questions throughout, sharp, specific questions that Lenora recognized as the questions of someone who already understood the shape of the case and was verifying the details rather than discovering them. That was a good sign, she thought. A man who asks good questions has been paying attention. Prescott's response was what she had expected: methodical challenges to the provenance of each piece of evidence, arguments about the admissibility of documents obtained from a county employee, questions about Osley's credibilities as a witness with a personal grievance against his former employer. But Beatrice had prepared for all of it. She had anticipated every challenge the way you anticipate every possible failure when you are running a farm alone and cannot afford to be surprised, because the cost of being surprised, when you have no margin, is ruin. When Prescott challenged Merritt's notebook, Beatrice produced the Territorial Land Office's own correspondence log, confirming the existence of the informal filing that Merritt had recorded. When Prescott attacked Osley's credibility, Beatrice read aloud from 3 of Osley's payment ledgers, not his testimony about them, the ledgers themselves, in Kincaid's own handwriting on the approval lines, and asked Webb to consider whether a man fabricating a grievance would have had access to his former employer's signed financial records. When Prescott suggested that the bank's loan accelerations were standard practice unconnected to Kincaid's acquisition interests, Beatrice introduced Hendricks's written statement and read the key sentence aloud into the record. Mr. Kincaid has been very patient with your account. I'd take the settlement while he's still inclined to offer one. The room was quiet after that, the particular quiet of people who have heard something that cannot be unheard. Webb looked at the statement, then at Kincaid. Kincaid's expression had not broken, she would give him that. Whatever he was feeling, he was holding it behind the same composed face he'd brought into the room. But Prescott had gone slightly still beside him, in the way of an attorney who is recalculating rapidly and is not entirely pleased with what the calculation is returning. Lenora was called to give her own account. She sat in the chair beside Webb's desk and answered Beatrice's questions in the same order the case had been laid out her father's letter. The conversation with Merritt, writing to Osley, the ride to Beatrice's office, the fire, Kincaid's visit to the farm with his settlement offer. She was not a natural performer and she knew it. She spoke too carefully sometimes, and not carefully enough at others. At one point she lost track of a date and had to stop and think, which she did openly, right there in front of Webb and Prescott and the 30 people along the walls, because pretending to be certain when she wasn't would be the kind of lie that undid things. Prescott cross-examined her. He was skilled, she'd give him that too. He came at the edges of things, suggesting she'd been coached, suggesting her interpretation of events was colored by financial desperation, suggesting that a woman in her financial position might have reason to misrepresent the circumstances of her conversations with county employees. She answered him steadily. When he pushed, she pushed back not with heat, just with the flat factual resistance of someone who knows what happened and is not going to agree that it happened differently because the alternative framing is more convenient. At one point, Prescott said, with the particular calibrated condescension of a man who thinks condescension is a strategy, "You're asking this court to accept the testimony of a struggling female landholder against one of the most established businessmen in this county." Webb looked up from his notes. "I'm asking the court to accept documentation," Beatrice said before Lenora could respond. "The gender and financial situation of the person who gathered it is not relevant to whether the documents say what they say." Webb made a note. Prescott moved on. The hearing ran until late afternoon. When it ended, Webb did not rule immediately. He said he required time to review the full record and would issue findings within 2 weeks. Which was normal, Beatrice said afterward. Which was how these things went. They walked out into the Millhaven afternoon, all of them. Lenora and Beatrice and Osley, and Merritt, and the sun was lower, and the air was marginally cooler, and the street outside was ordinary in the way streets are when you have just come out of something extraordinary, and the world has not registered it yet. Osley shook Lenora's hand. He held it a moment longer than necessary, and she understood it was not just courtesy, but something that needed to be marked somehow. "Whatever comes," he said, "I'm glad I came." "So am I," she said. Merritt said nothing elaborate. He put on his hat and adjusted his repaired spectacles and nodded at her once, the specific nod of a man who kept his promises to himself after all, and walked to where his horse was tied. Beatrice walked with her to the wagon. 2 weeks, she said. Possibly less. Webb was engaged with the evidence. "That's not nothing." "What do you think?" Lenora said. Beatrice was not a woman who dealt in false comfort. She thought about her answer before she gave it. "I think the documentation is overwhelming. I think Hendricks's statement may be the single most damaging piece, a man inside Kincaid's own financial mechanism, acknowledging coordination. I think Prescott knows they're in difficulty." She paused. "I also think Kincaid has resources and contacts we may not have fully mapped, and I don't count anything as finished until it's finished." She looked at Lenora. "Go home. Take care of your hands. Don't do anything rash for 2 weeks." "I'm not a rash person," Lenora said. "No," Beatrice agreed. "You're not." Something softened slightly at the edges of her professional expression. "Your father would have been proud today." Lenora got in the wagon and drove home. Calder was waiting at the gate. He'd been there a while. She could tell he'd finished every visible task and run out of things to do with his hands, which for him was unusual enough to be its own kind of statement. She climbed down and he looked at her face, reading it the way he'd learned to read it. "How did it go?" he said. "We laid everything out," she said. "Webb is good." He was paying attention. She untied the horse from the wagon. 2 weeks for the ruling. He took the horse from her gently, without making it a comment on her hands, and led it toward the paddock. She walked beside him. "Prescott is good too," she said. "He came at me hard. You held." I held. She was quiet for a few steps. "He tried the thing where you suggest the person is lying because they have reason to lie, because they're desperate. Standard play, I know. But it's effective because it's partly true. I am in a desperate situation. That doesn't make me wrong about what happened." She stopped at the paddock gate while he led the horse in. "I kept thinking this is what Kincaid counted on. That a woman who needs money is automatically suspect. That the need itself is evidence against her. Some people believe that," Calder said. Webb didn't look like one of them. "Good." She leaned on the paddock fence and looked at the farm around her in the late light. The cleared barn site, the stacked timber, the livestock in their improvised arrangements, the north pump, the dry hills beyond the fence line, going amber in the last of the sun. You said you wanted to talk, she said, after the hearing. He latched the paddock gate and stood on the other side of it for a moment, and she could see him doing the thing he sometimes did before saying something that mattered, settling himself, making sure the words were the right ones. I've been thinking about what happens after this, he said. However it resolves. If the ruling goes the way it should, you'll have documentation of the aquifer filed legally on record. The farm's value changes, the bank's position changes. Everything changes. Yes, you won't need a ranch hand the same way you did 6 weeks ago. The immediate emergency will be over. He looked at her directly. I want to stay. Not because you need labor, because this is the first place in 3 years that has felt like somewhere worth staying. She looked at him. Just the place? Something shifted in his expression, a kind of careful honesty that she'd come to associate with the moments when Calder Fenwick stopped managing what he was feeling and just said it. No, he said. Not just the place. Then say the rest of it, she said. Plainly, I'm not going to hear it wrong. He exhaled. I want to be here. With you. In whatever way makes sense to you, however much space you need, however this goes. I'm not asking you to be different than you are. I'm not asking you to need me. I'm asking whether there's room for me to stay, because I want to, not because you're in crisis. She was quiet for a moment. The paddock fence was between them, which was maybe appropriate, this conversation happening across a boundary, both of them on their own sides of it, nobody crossing until it was clear. I've been carrying this farm alone for 14 months, she said. And before that I was carrying it beside my father, which is a different kind of alone. I don't know how to need someone. I'm not sure I ever learned. She looked at her hands, the scars, the new calluses building over the old ones. But I know that the last 6 weeks have been less impossible than the 14 months before them. And I know the difference is you, not your labor you. The way you say the hard, honest thing. The way you don't pretend my size is invisible or a problem. The way you sat in the dirt after the barn burned and just stayed there. He was watching her. I don't know how to do this gracefully, she said. I want to warn you about that. I'm going to be difficult and stubborn, and I'm going to try to do things alone when I shouldn't, and I'm going to forget to say things that should be said. I know, he said. I've met you. She almost laughed, the real kind, the one that came up without asking permission. Then yes, she said. There's room. He opened the paddock gate from his side, not rushing it, just opening the boundary between them, which was enough. They stood together in the amber late light, and the farm went quiet around them the way it does. At that hour, not silent, just settled, the sounds dropping into a lower register that feels like rest. It was not a perfect moment. Her left hand was aching, and she was exhausted from the day, and there was still a 2-week wait for a ruling that wasn't guaranteed, and the barn wasn't rebuilt, and she'd eaten nothing since early morning. It was real, which was better than perfect. Webb's ruling came in 11 days, not 2 weeks. Beatrice sent a rider before breakfast, 2 riders this time, which told Lenora before she opened the door that something significant had happened. The ruling was 43 pages. Beatrice had summarized it in a letter that ran to 3 pages itself. But the essential points were clear enough that Lenora understood them, standing at the kitchen table in her morning clothes with Calder over her shoulder. The injunction against the foreclosure was made permanent, pending the full resolution of the land fraud proceedings. The geological survey documents were admitted as evidence of material concealment. Kincaid's acquisition of 6 properties through fraudulent non-disclosure was subject to immediate federal review. The Territorial Land Office was directed to examine all property transfers in the southern tier of Harrow County, dating to 1882, and assess them against the geological survey data. Hendricks was referred to a banking oversight authority for investigation of improper loan practices. And the piece that Lenora read 3 times before she let herself fully understand it, the aquifer beneath the southern tier properties, including Red Willow Farm, was legally documented in the public land record. It was hers. The knowledge of it, the legal recognition of it, the water rights attached to it. No longer a secret held by a man who'd been hoarding it like a weapon. She sat down. Calder read the rest of the letter standing behind her, and when he finished, he put it back on the table and was quiet. It's not over, she said. The full case will take time. It won't matter for the farm, he said. The foreclosure is gone. The aquifer is documented. Whatever happens in the broader case, Red Willow is secure. She pressed her hands flat on the table, both of them, the scarred left and the right, and looked at them. 14 months of mornings. 14 months of waking up at 4 in the dark and lying there for 20 minutes trying to decide if today was the day it became impossible, and then getting up anyway. 14 months of being the only person at this table, the only person deciding, the only one who knew the full weight of it. She was still at this table. The farm was still here. "We need to tell the families," she said. They spent that day driving from farm to farm, Calder driving, Lenora getting down at each place and knocking on doors, and telling people in Plaintiles what the ruling meant. Clara Ferris sat down hard on her porch step when Lenora told her, and then pressed her hand over her mouth, and then said, "My husband when he finds out," and stopped. And Lenora sat down on the step beside her and said nothing. Because there are things that don't need a response, just a witness. Della Pruitt hugged her, which Lenora was not prepared for, and which was slightly awkward because Della was a small woman and the geometry was not easy, but she let it happen and was glad she did. Old Taggart shook her hand, and then his son Nathan shook her hand. And then Taggart said, gruffly, in the voice of a man allergic to sentiment, "Your father would have been difficult about accepting congratulations." "He would have," she agreed. "You're the same," he said. It was, she understood, the highest compliment he knew how to give. Merritt Dunbar got the news through official channels before she could reach him, and when she stopped at his office on the way home, he was behind his counter, looking simultaneously like a man who has been relieved of something very heavy, and like a man who is not quite ready to believe it's gone. "The Wichita case," he said. "They've connected the contact at the land office in Austin to Vane's operation. The man is being removed from his position." "I heard," she said. Beatrice wrote it in the summary. 3 years, Merritt said quietly. "I kept that notebook for 3 years, not knowing if it would ever mean anything." "It meant everything," she said. "You know that." He polished his spectacles, put them back on. "I'm glad you came in asking questions. Even if I was terrified when you did." "So was I," she said. Terrified is not the same as wrong. She meant it as a simple thing. But she heard it as she said it and understood it was something she'd been learning for a long time without having a sentence for it. Terrified is not the same as wrong. Kincaid accepted the federal settlement 6 weeks later. It was not an admission of guilt in the way a trial verdict is. That was one of the things Beatrice had told her honestly at the beginning, that fraud cases of this scale often resolved in settlements that stopped short of a defendant standing in a courtroom and saying the words, "I did it." But the settlement required Kincaid to relinquish claims to 4 of the 6 disputed properties, provide restitution payments to the families who had sold under fraudulent loan pressure, and submit to a 5-year oversight period on all future land transactions in the territory. Hendricks resigned from the bank. The new manager sent Lenora a letter informing her that her original loan terms had been restored and the accelerated schedule reversed. The Birch family, who had sold and moved to Fort Worth, received a restitution payment significant enough that they could have returned to the county if they'd wanted. They didn't return. Their children were in school in Fort Worth, and their life had rebuilt itself in a different shape, but they wrote to Lenora. It was a short letter from Mrs. Birch, and it said, "We thought we had failed. Thank you for proving we hadn't." Lenora kept that letter in her father's desk. She put it in the folder where the geological survey had been the empty folder where Harold had once kept his most important knowledge. And then she closed the drawer. The warrant against Calder Fenwick was formally cleared on a Tuesday morning in September. Kane brought the paperwork himself. He rode out to the farm and found Calder at the south fence, the same kind of work, the same man who had been doing it since the beginning, and handed him the documents without ceremony, because Kane was not a ceremonial man. Calder read through the papers, folded them, put them in his shirt pocket. "That's it?" Kane said. "What else should there be?" Calder said. Kane looked at him for a moment. Most men would be less calm about this. "I've had time to prepare," Calder said. He picked up the wire he'd set down. "Thank you, Marshal. For the Abilene inquiry. For all of it." Kane nodded. He looked across the farm at the house, at the new barn taking shape in the lot where the burned one had been, at the cleared channel running from the well toward the south pasture, where they'd begun the preliminary work for the water system the aquifer would eventually support. "Good farm," he said. "It is," Calder said. Kane rode out. Calder watched him go and then went back to the fence. Lenora had seen all of this from the porch. She didn't go down immediately. She let him have the moment of being a man without a warrant for the first time in 3 years, standing in a field he'd chosen to stay in, doing ordinary work. It seemed like something that needed to be felt without an audience. When she went down eventually and stood at the fence, he was still working, but the set of his shoulders was different, looser, like a weight distributed differently across his frame. "You could go anywhere now," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to make sure you understand that. The warrant is clear. You're not staying because you're stuck. You're staying because you're choosing." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Lenora, I moved for 3 years. I know the difference between stuck and choosing. I just wanted to say it plainly. I know you did." His voice was warm. "You always want things said plainly. It's better than the alternative." "It is," he agreed. She leaned on the fence post beside him. The morning was cooler than it had been, the season finally beginning to shift, the absolute killing heat of the Texas summer starting to soften at its edges. She could smell something different in the air when the wind came from the north, the suggestion of a season that was not drought. That was not the same burning sameness of the last 3 years. "I was thinking," she said, "about the South Channel. If we extended another 40 yards toward the Pruitt boundary and put in a second gate, we could share draw rights with them in a drought year. Legal agreement, formally documented. Reasonable rate." He thought about it. They'd need to contribute to the maintenance of the channel. Of course. Fair share, proportional to use. You'd want Beatrice to draft the agreement. "I'd want Beatrice to draft it," she confirmed. He looked at the South Channel, calculating she could see him working through the engineering of it in his head, the way he did with anything structural, quietly and thoroughly, before he said a word. "That's a good idea," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. The neighbors came to rebuild the barn on a Saturday in October. Not just the immediate neighbors, more people than she'd expected, more than had come after the fire. People from further out in the county who had heard about the hearing and the settlement and the aquifer documentation, and had come to see for themselves the woman who had managed all of that, with 2 injured hands and a ranch in debt and a drifting cowboy she'd taken on for 50 cents a day. Some of them she recognized, some she didn't. All of them brought something: tools, timber, food, labor, the particular combination of practical resources that frontier people bring to the work of rebuilding, because they understand that what happens to one farm can happen to any farm, and the only real insurance against that is each other. Clara Ferris came and worked all day alongside the men on the frame. Old Taggart directed things with the confidence of a man who has built more barns than he can count, which was probably true. Della Pruitt ran the food table with the same authority she brought to everything, and refused to let anyone go hungry, which meant the work went better than it might have. Lenora worked too. She couldn't do everything. Her left hand was selective about what it would allow, and she'd learned in the past months to listen to it rather than fight it, but she worked steadily at what she could manage, passing timber, holding braces, doing the 100 small necessary things that don't look like much, but without which nothing comes together. Calder worked at the center of it. He had a natural quality with group labor that she'd noticed before: the ability to organize without seeming to organize, to redirect effort without making anyone feel redirected, to do the hardest physical work without making it look like performance. By afternoon, the frame was up, which was further than anyone had expected to get in a single day. Someone brought a fiddle. She didn't know who. She heard it start up as the sun went lower, and the work shifted into something more like celebration. And the yard of Red Willow Farm was full of people she knew, and people she was still learning, and the sound of something that was genuinely, imperfectly good. She found herself standing at the edge of it, not apart, just at the edge, watching the frame of the new barn catch the last light, watching the people in her yard. Holding a cup of coffee she'd stopped drinking because she kept forgetting about it. Calder came and stood beside her. "You should be in the middle of this," he said. "I am in the middle of it," she said. "This is just where the middle is for me." He looked at her sideways. "You know what I mean. I know what you mean. And I know who I am." She drank the cold coffee and made a face at it. "I've never been the kind of person who is comfortable being celebrated. I'd rather just have the thing, the barn, the farm, the water, the case resolved." She paused. "The company." He didn't say anything. He just stood there with her at the edge of the light and the noise. And that was the right response, which was why she trusted him the way she did. There is something that Lenora Ashcombe understood by the time that autumn was over, not something she'd read or been told, but something she arrived at through the specific experience of the specific life she'd lived, in the specific imperfect way she'd lived it. She'd been told all her life that her size was a liability, that a woman built the way she was built was not built for this, not for frontier life, not for physical labor, not for the respect of neighbors or the attention of men or the kind of story where someone worth having chose her. She'd been told this directly and indirectly, by words and by the particular silences that land harder than words sometimes. And she'd believed it, partially. She'd carried it in the way that people carry the things they've been told about themselves since childhood, not consciously, but in the bones, in the place that says, I have to work harder to deserve what other people are simply given. What she understood now, having been through all of it, was that the belief had been wrong, not partially wrong. Wrong. Her size had not prevented her from running this farm. It had not prevented her from riding 18 miles with injured hands to an attorney's office. It had not prevented her from building a coalition of neighbors, gathering evidence, standing across from Vernon Kincaid in her own yard, and refusing his settlement without flinching. It had not prevented Calder Fenwick from seeing her, seeing all of her. The stubbornness and the intelligence and the humor she kept close to the chest and the very specific way she sat on the porch step when she was done pretending and just needed to be somewhere quiet and deciding that was what he wanted to be near. She understood that strength is not what people look like. Strength is what they do when they're terrified and they do it anyway. Strength is what it costs to keep getting up and what you learn about yourself in the getting up and who you find beside you when you stop having to do it alone. She had thought for a long time that her size was what other people saw first, and that this was the problem she was always solving. She'd been solving the wrong problem. The problem was never her body. The problem was the people who used it as an excuse to dismiss what was underneath. And those people had lost. In November, Lenora and Calder were married at the farm. Not a large event. Beatrice was there, and the Pruitts and Taggart and his sons, and Clara Ferris and Merritt Dunbar, who polished his spectacles before the ceremony and did not apologize for it. Osley came from Denton Creek. Kane rode over from the county seat and stood at the back and looked like a man attending something he found unexpectedly moving. The new barn was finished behind them. The aquifer documentation was filed in public. The South Channel extension was half built, which would be finished before winter. The farm was not in debt. The animals were healthy. Nothing about the ceremony was smooth or polished. The words were plain. The air smelled like wood smoke, and the animals were audible in the background. And at one point, one of Taggart's sons dropped something metal at the worst possible moment, and everyone laughed, including Lenora and Calder, which was probably the right way for a ceremony like this to go. When it was over, when everyone had eaten and talked and gradually found their way home in the darkening afternoon, Lenora and Calder stood together in the yard beside the new barn. She looked at her hands. Both of them, in the light from the barn opening. The scars on the left palm had settled into something permanent pale lines, crossing the darker lines of her work, the map of the summer written into her skin. The right had its own new calluses, its own history. Calder took both of her hands in his. Not carefully, not the way you handle something fragile, just the way you hold something real. She looked at him. He was a man who had spent 3 years running from something he hadn't done, who had arrived at a broken gate with nothing and stayed, because something here was worth staying for. He was not uncomplicated. He was not without his own damage and his own silences and his own mornings when old things sat heavy on him. He was real, which was the same thing as imperfect, and also the same thing as enough. I want to tell you something, she said. All right. You came here with nothing, she said, and you gave me the thing I needed most, which wasn't labor. It was the idea that carrying something alone isn't the same as carrying it well. She looked at their joined hands. I was proud of surviving alone. I still am. But I understand now that I was also just enduring. There's a difference. He was quiet, listening the way he did. I don't know how to be easy about things, she said. I'm not going to learn overnight. I know. And you're not either, so we're even. We are, he said. The night came down around Red Willow Farm the way night always had gradually from the east, softening the edges of things before it claimed them entirely. The cattle settled. The new barn stood solid and smelling of fresh wood. The pump at the north well ran its steady sound into the dark, the same sound it had made for years. The sound of water coming from deep underground, patient and uninterruptible, the thing beneath the surface that had been there all along. Lenora looked at the farm, her father's farm. Hers now hers and Calder's, going forward into whatever forward was, with no guarantee of ease and no promise of perfect and no version of the story where the hard things don't happen. Just the farm, the water, the work, the man beside her who had chosen to stay, and the understanding earned slowly, at real cost, through 2 scarred hands and 14 months alone, and a summer that tried to break her that the most valuable thing on Red Willow had never been what lay beneath the ground. It had always been the woman who refused to leave it.